Morning, Marley. Seems like just the two of us are on so far.
Good morning. Yes, it appears that way. Everybody's getting those last couple minutes of shut eye.
Yeah, I never know quite for sure if my computer is going to be working or the microphone or whatever. So I try and get on a little bit early. Morning.
Exactly.
Good morning. Hi, Marley.
Good morning, Erica. How are you?
Good. And is that Chris?
Yes, I'm in the process of renaming myself this
Okay.
morning.
How are you, Marley?
I'm doing well. Doing well. It's super warm here in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, here too.
Really? Yeah.
Oh, it's so warm. It's kind of crazy. I mean, it's like early October.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I like your earrings.
Oh,
The plovers?
yes.
Yeah.
I thought, well, if I have to introduce the speakers and everybody. I thought, oh, okay.
That's
So,
awesome.
Erica, are you going to rename yourself so you're not Waterbird
Oh,
Society
okay.
one?
Oh, yeah, yes. Sorry. Yes, I didn't realize I will. Hey, Marley, did you go through the practice already, or?
Yes, I think I might just try to share my screen one more time, just to make sure it works properly. Okay, let's give this a try.
Nice.
That seems to be working. Very beautiful picture.
Yeah.
Oh yes, it's not mine. Which is- okay, you can see that.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think so I should write down. So what, Chris, I guess we should figure out who is doing what, right? So I'm introducing Juliet, and I noticed that the schedule all says 8:30, but in fact the talk's not till 9. So do you think I should start a couple minutes before 9, or should I start right at 9?
Well, I think I'd start a couple minutes early just because, we're always so, by the time we do the changeover and change screens and, I don't know if Juliet's planning on taking her whole hour. So I'd guess I'd get started and people can then kind of settle in and be ready to pay attention. So I'll try and, if you want to continue to introduce everybody, that would be fine with me.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I'd like to do, just because I was the one that invited everybody. So
Good.
Yeah.
That works. And I'll kind of keep track of admitting people and that sort of thing.
And have you seen the admits? Because I've already admitted a few people. Are you getting it too?
Yes. So so anyway, whoever's doing, we can both admit, but I'll try and pay most attention to that.
Okay.
So,
and then in terms of sharing the screen, giving the capability of sharing the screen with the speakers, because Patty said something about if too many people have that co-host, then it could mess things up. So after somebody speaks, can you co-host them? And
well, I need to find that button and I'm not finding it right now.
So how did you do it for Marley?
I didn't do anything for Marley.
Oh, and she was just able to. Okay, so there are two ways. You can go through security and just have share screen, allow participants to share screen. Actually, I can do that right now, and so everybody can share their screen. That saves that.
Okay, I see. We went over this little box here, but I couldn't remember where we started it. So
yeah, now oftentimes you're supposed to be able to do it in participants under more, but I don't see that. So I just did it in security. So, but I think I'm gonna have to, all right, so you see security at the bottom?
Yeah, so I found that there. Oh, and okay, so I see co-host, okay, now I see what we what we talked about in the training over here under,
Participants.
yes.
Okay, so I wonder whether with the security,
Oh, okay,
every
wait a
time-
minute. So Marley, because she was the first to sign on, she's now the host.
oh
So
dear.
Marley, you need to come on and either designate myself or Erica is the host.
Okay, sure thing. Just a second here.
I'm surprised she was able to sign on. That
I
seems-
didn't know I had that kind of power.
I know.
Oh, I know, very.
Okay, that should work now.
Okay, all right. So that's good. So now I've got power and Erica's got power, so.
Yeah,
Good.
and you've got the big power, so that's great.
Oh, okay, well, I hope so. All right.
Yeah, you're right. This half hour for just admitting people is useful.
Yeah, I think so, because there's, well, if I did this every day of my life, I'd be better at it, but.
I do it every day, but I still don't know everything. I still have to, oh, what was that?
Morning, Dave.
Morning, Dave.
Yes, if I did this every day too, it would be simpler. Morning.
I do it multiple times a day, every day. But still.
It's the platforms too. Like we use one,
Oh yeah.
everybody else is using
Teams,
another.
yeah.
Like
Well, so far, so far I've just got Marley as one of the speakers, so.
do you guys know, like, you know how some people have pictures associated with their like when they're off camera, the picture pops up.
Yes,
Like I did all that stuff in the profile, but it doesn't seem to pop. Like most people don't have photos. So I was just wondering, like, is there something I'm
yeah, I'm
missing?
not sure
or-
how you do it, yeah.
I have it for another platform, but it's beyond me for this one.
I think it's through your actual like Zoom account online.
Oh, Zoom
Uh,
account. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Sounds like the silent auction's doing well.
Oh, yeah, it does,
Ask that
yes.
question. I'm actually trying to figure that out right now as you were asking.
Well, I haven't been outbid yet, so I'm just waiting.
Oh,
'Cause
it's
I bid on a
coming.
lot of stuff.
It's coming, Liz.
Yes, I know, I bid on a lot, and I've been outbid on almost everything. I'm
'Cause
surprised.
I'm ready to bid back.
No han hablado, ¿cierto, amor?
No. Llamaron a listo.
Mentiroso.
Good morning, everybody. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes. Okay, I would like to welcome everyone to this session. I see that there's still people being admitted. My name is Erica Knoll, and Chris Custer is here helping me with the technical and admitting people. But I think we will get so that Juliet has enough time to give her presentation. I am moderating today's session And first, I just want to respectfully acknowledge that I'm speaking this morning from the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. I offer them their gratitude for their teachings and stewardship of this time immemorial. This land, part of Turtle Island, is now known as Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. I feel very privileged to be able to introduce our first speaker to kick off the symposium on the dynamics of waterbird migration. Dr. Juliet Lamb is a talented and valuable Waterbird Society. In every task that she has volunteered her time for, she has moved the needle forward in both inclusion and diversity, and then exciting for our members. She's organized countless interesting and valuable events for past and this conference, and she is the co-founder of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. In addition, she has received numerous awards, including writing awards in her days as a high school and university student, travel awards from both Pacific Seabird Group and the Waterbird Society. She was a finalist in a 3-minute thesis competition, which speaks to her excellent communication skills we're going to hear in a few minutes. She won first prize in the World Seabird Twitter Conference, showing her skills in social media, and she has won an award for a published paper that has contributed to conservation from our society, the Waterbird Society. So this is just a few of the many awards that she has received. She conducted her PhD with Pat Jodas at Clemson University on ecological drivers of brown pelican movement and reproduction. Julia is currently a Marie Curie Fellow at the Centre d'écologie fonctionnelle et évolutive in Montpellier, France. Her presentation title captures beautifully the function of the symposium, which is to look at individual variation in migration in migratory behavior of waterbirds. Her title, Go Your Own Way from Individual to Population Level Patterns in Waterbird Migration. So with that, I'll turn it over to Juliet.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to make sure that the screen sharing works the way it's supposed to before I start. Does this look okay to everyone?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Erica, for that introduction. I feel like I have a lot to live up to, but I will do my best. So I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to you and to introduce this symposium, which I'm extremely excited about. I am really interested and have been for a while in looking at individual drivers of migration ecology. So the symposium is right up my alley. And I'm excited to share with you a couple of the projects that I've worked on that sort of fit into this category, as well as to introduce some of the concepts surrounding individual variation in migration, and to introduce some of the really exciting talks that are going to be following up mine. So I hope that you'll plan to stick around to hear all of the speakers this morning. And I am sorry if anyone gets Fleetwood Mac stuck in their head, but not really sorry. So there you go. All right, so the definition of migration per BirdLife International, or of a migratory species anyway, is a species where a substantial proportion of the global or regional population makes regular cyclical movements beyond the breeding range with predictable timing and destinations. And I think that's an important definition to highlight, just because there are some things in the definition that are a little bit open to interpretation. And I think that's a little bit of what we're going to be talking about, is how individuals do different things during migration and how that affects the status of the population as a whole. But in general, it captures the idea that migration is a response to some kind of seasonal variability. So this is variability both externally in things like climate and availability of resources, and it's also variability internally at the individual level in energetic requirements and what period of the annual cycle the birds are in at the time. And migration, although we think about, the really spectacular aspect of migration is this large-scale coordinated movement. So we tend to really focus on the things that are similar among individuals, but actually migration isn't always a uniform phenomenon, and perhaps more often than not is highly variable across ranges of species and even within populations. So for example, different individuals in different portions of the range may be overlapping during breeding and then separating and overlapping with individuals from other breeding areas during the non-breeding season, as in this figure. And this individual variation isn't observable. If you look at a group of birds, you can't tell which birds are migratory and which birds are non-migratory. And often even birds that overlap during both breeding and non-breeding may be separating during other parts of their migration, for example, at stopover sites, as in this second figure. So even if you're able to track birds where they're resident on their breeding grounds and on their non-breeding grounds, you may be missing important aspects of segregation and individual variability in migration. So just a couple of figures for you. So across all the bird species, about 20% are migratory. So birds overall are predominantly non-migratory. However, when you look at waterbirds alone, for all waterbirds, the figure is closer to about 41%. And this is a little bit variable depending on what definition you use, how many species you include, what's a waterbird, what's a migrant. All of these things add some variability, but the value kind of hovers around 40%. And then if you look at just marine and coastal birds, that value is actually closer to 50%. So compared to all birds overall, the birds that we study actually are much more migratory. And this kind of tracks more with what you would expect when you think about these water birds that are undertaking really spectacular migrations. You know, some of the examples of the record holders for altitude, for duration, for endurance flight, and for distance in migration are water birds. So really the taxa that we study are generally pretty migratory compared to birds overall. And you may remember this paper that came out a couple of years ago by Rosenberg et al. That found that close to 3 billion birds have been lost over the last 50 years. And many of these come from species that are relatively numerous. So yesterday we heard a lot about species that have only 50 or 60 individuals in their entire population. But the species that are driving these huge declines in birds are actually the more numerous species. So in some ways, we really need to focus on these species as well, even though they're not currently necessarily in any danger. And the authors of that paper have since proposed a framework for improving migratory species conservation. So rather than going straight from figuring out species that are in decline to implementing conservation actions, their suggestion is to focus on understanding what populations actually are. So defining populations that are linked by movement, migrants moving from breeding to non-breeding areas and using stopover sites, estimating vital rates across the annual cycle, so understanding what periods of the annual cycle and in what locations declines are occurring. And then once those limiting periods and locations have been identified, then and only then can you really start to optimize conservation action to actually reverse some of these declines. And we are living in kind of a golden age of information on migratory movement and individual variation because we're able to take kind of a mechanistic view of how individuals moved across a landscape. So traditionally, we were confined to what Mr. Euler is doing here on this bridge, which is watching animals move through the landscape. So we sit on a mountain, we count migratory hawks going by. We go to a specific place and we count how many birds are there, and we look at what period during the annual cycle they're there. And we try to figure out how these things are connected, but we have really a static view of what's happening on the landscape at any given time. However, with the advent of individual-based telemetry, which may seem recent, but actually, given that it's been around for about 40 years, is probably older than the median age of people attending this meeting, I would venture to guess. We have actually many decades now of tracking data on some larger bodied species that have been able to be tracked since the beginning. And at the same time, tracking devices are getting smaller, so we're actually able to gather data on smaller and smaller species as they move through the landscape. And this gives us the perspective more like Mr. Lagrange here in this illustration, who's on his boat going down the river, of an individual moving through the landscape and experiencing conditions in different places across the landscape and kind of connecting different areas together. So as you can see, these two perspectives are different and they might give you different information, but they're not contradictory, they're complementary. So they're both telling you things about what's happening on the landscape, and kind of uniting these perspectives together can give us an understanding of not only how individuals are distributed, but how individual movements and variation link those distributions together across the annual cycle. So it's a really exciting time to be working on these questions and to start to understand linkages between populations at the individual level. So just to give some definitions that I'll be kind of talking about later in the talk. There are different types of variation in migration. So partial migration, which is illustrated here, would be where a portion of a population or species remains resident on the breeding grounds throughout the year, and another portion undertakes some kind of cyclical movement to non-breeding areas. We also have differential migration. So this would be where different groups of individuals sharing some kind of characteristics within the breeding population move to different areas during the non-breeding season and actually segregate spatially. We have the concept of migratory connectivity, which is where individuals that breed closer together also winter closer together. So there's some kind of grouping of populations that's maintained across the annual cycle. We have dispersive migration, which is a case where individuals are moving, not in really a coordinated way, but actually just kind of moving away from the breeding site to different non-breeding areas, and then coming together during breeding. And then we have facultative migration, which is where individuals can vary their breeding strategy, their migration strategy from year to year, and may be able to remain resident or migrate depending on conditions and depending on their own internal conditions as well. So some of the reasons that these kinds of variation could occur at the individual level would be sex-based differences. So we have an example of migratory songbirds in Europe. Overall, males tend to arrive earlier at migration sites and breeding areas compared to females. And this is across multiple species and taxa. We have age. So this is an example from Corey's shearwaters, where earlier in their life cycle, in the juvenile years of their lives, birds will arrive later at the colony for the breeding season. And as they age and mature, their arrival dates get earlier and earlier. So this can obviously have effects on reproductive success and fitness down the line. Body size can be a contributor to migration. Physical condition can be a contributor as well, which is separate from body size and obviously more variable. So this is an example from white ruffed manakins in Costa Rica, where Boyle found that migrants, altitudinal migrants in this species tended to be in poorer physical condition than individuals that remained resident. So there may be, some effect of being able to stay in suboptimal environmental conditions if you're in better physical condition, but needing to migrate if you're in poorer condition. There can be geographical variation where individuals in different parts of their range are doing different things. There's variation in breeding success, and there's variation in genetics. So this is the example of black caps, which is kind of the traditional example of genetic influences on migration, where individuals from different populations, juveniles that are raised in captivity and never have the opportunity to migrate in real life, are attempting to undertake migratory movements in the direction that their population of origin would be undertaking. So all of these things obviously are not mutually exclusive. They can interact in many different ways to structure migratory patterns across populations and species. So why does it matter? Why do we really care about what individuals are doing? Don't we want to know what the population as a whole is doing? Well, these individual characteristics can have a lot of trickle-down effects. So individuals that vary in their timing of migration, their migratory routes, their duration of stopovers and use of different stopover sites, their wintering locations, and the speed of migration. These different kinds of variations can expose them to differential exposure to risk, different diet characteristics, different environmental conditions, different availability of mating opportunities, differing levels of breeding success, differing energy expenditure, differing disease risk, and this is only a partial list. So any of these different interactions of individuals with the environment can have broader effects that eventually scale up to patterns that we see in populations. And it's hard to really enact conservation without understanding how all of these different factors interact and contribute and how they might interact in the future under different environmental and climate change scenarios. So that's kind of my general introduction. So my work in particular focuses mainly on nearshore seabirds. The talks that we're going to be hearing in the rest of the symposium focus on other taxa, but I'll just briefly say, nearshore seabirds are interesting in a lot of ways, in a lot of the things that I mentioned as being, potential population level effects of individual variation, because they interact with humans a lot and they're exposed to a lot of different risk factors in the environment that can vary very much spatially. So out in marine systems, pelagic seabirds are experiencing a relatively homogeneous environment compared to nearshore seabirds that are moving along heavily developed coastlines and interacting with human populations. So I'm going to talk about 2 case studies that I've worked on, and both of these are kind of examples of the way that having large-scale tracking data that's been collected over a decade or even several decades can give you insight into what's happening over the entire range of a species. So I'm really grateful to have been able to be involved with these studies and to be able to synthesize some of the information that they've provided. So to start out, I'll talk about work with brown pelicans. So brown pelicans are, as I mentioned, a coastal seabird and numerous and highly visible along the coastlines of the United States and Central and South America. And they're a useful indicator species because they're really visible victims of things like oil spills and pollutants, and they're very readily exposed to these given their interactions with humans, with fisheries, discards, and with contaminants in coastal areas. And their conservation history is really interesting. So they were basically extirpated from the Western Gulf of Mexico due to the effects of contaminants, particularly endrin, and as well as organic chlorines. And they were one of the first species to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. The population rebounded pretty quickly, and they were delisted recently in 2009. But this is a species that's also subject to a lot of different spatial conservation regimes, and understanding species of this species is particularly important given its conservation history. So going back to the Endangered Species Act, when the species was delisted, it was actually delisted sequentially. So the Eastern Distinct Population segment, which is kind of delineated here by the red lines, was delisted earlier due to recovery. The Western Gulf and the Occidentalis subspecies in the Caribbean were delisted later. And this was, basically based on recovery trajectories, but not based on any detailed understanding of movement. So these kind of population segments were imposed really based on what was being observed about population patterns. We also have in the Gulf of Mexico a system of regions, planning areas that are used for offshore energy planning. So we have the central planning area that's very highly developed, the western planning area that's a little bit less developed, and the eastern planning area that's undeveloped. So if you compare those 2 maps, you can see that they don't really line up. So these are kind of 2 different ways of dividing up the pelican population to manage it. And again, a third way of dividing up the population is the way that allocation of resources following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill was done on a state-by-state basis. So again, this is each state considering the pelicans that are breeding within that state to be its own kind of separate population, which is a third way of dividing up the population. So none of these, if you're looking closely, really have anything to do with pelican movement, migration, or kind of interactions across these different regions. So that was kind of where the work that I did as a PhD student came in. And pelicans are resident throughout their range. They're generally considered to be resident, but there's some data, before we started large scale tracking, there was some data suggesting that they move around a little bit more. So starting with in 1942 in California, there was a paper saying there's no evidence of any migratory movement on the part of young brown pelicans. But then we have later papers from the 70s and 80s that are actually showing some movement, but it's from banding data. So there's really no way to know whether it's dispersal, migration, or what's causing movement among regions and among countries. And in the 1980s and moving into the early 2000s, we had some small scale telemetry studies. And then the first study to really show long distance brown pelican migration was by King et al. In 2013. So they tracked 18 individuals from Louisiana, and they found these actually pretty long distance trans-Gulf migrations by pelicans. So this isn't quite as much of a resident species as people thought it was. So we started a tracking study back in 2013. Deployed transmitters on breeding adults in the Gulf of Mexico. So we used backpack transmitters that were solar recharging, so we could get multiple years of data from the same transmitter. and multiple data points per day. So between 2013 and 2016, we tracked 85 individuals using best technology in the Gulf of Mexico. And this was across 6 different colonies that corresponded to those 3 planning regions that I mentioned, so differing levels of oil and gas development offshore. And we also have a data set that I'm not going to be talking too much about, but I'll talk about a little bit from the Atlantic coast from 2010 to 2019, including 88 individuals captured during breeding and non-breeding in South Carolina and during breeding in the Chesapeake Bay. So between these 2 studies, this covers pretty much the entire eastern range of the brown pelican in the United States. And so the key questions that we were interested in were looking at what factors contribute to migratory decisions, how migration mediates individual exposure to risk, and how migratory movements contribute to population structure. So looking at the first of these questions, what factors contribute to individual migratory decisions? So we first found that there were basically 3 different migration strategies that pelicans were using. So we had short distance migrants that traveled less than 200 kilometers from their colony throughout the year. We had medium distance migrants that migrated basically from a breeding to a non-breeding site up to 1,000 kilometers away. And we had long distance migrants that undertook these kind of multi-stage migrations with stopovers that took them between 1,000 and 2,500 kilometers from their breeding sites. So there was everything really from completely resident behavior to long distance migratory behavior occurring within the population and occurring even within the same breeding sites. So each of these bars is a breeding site. You can see the red is short distance or resident birds, and the blue are migratory birds. Light blue is medium distance and dark blue is long distance. So looking at just the Gulf of Mexico, we had all 3 of these strategies occurring basically at every breeding colony without any really distinct patterns. However, on the Atlantic coast, you can see there's an increase in migratory distance and migration probability if you go from the south, South Carolina, to the north in Maryland. And actually in the northern part of their range, they're basically completely migratory. And I'm not going to talk much more about these data, but if you want to hear more about migration and the Atlantic population, you can head over to Brad Wilkinson's talk on Thursday, where we'll be covering more about that. But one of the interesting things that we found, at least in the Gulf, was that there's this strong effect of colony size. So if you're familiar with the concept of Ashmole's halo, this is where birds that are breeding in larger colonies tend to move further away from the colony site to forage during the breeding season because of the intraspecific competition. This also carried over into migration. So birds from larger colonies were more likely to migrate, and they were also likely to migrate longer distances. So this is really interesting. It seems that there's, some effect by which the local population density of birds is affecting the probability of migration in this partially migratory species. We've also found higher levels of migration in females compared to males. So males are more likely to remain resident, which is in the red bar in the graph below, and females more likely to migrate. And we found an interaction between migration and body size. So females didn't really show any difference in migratory propensity based on body size, but in males, we saw that larger bodied males were more likely to remain resident and smaller bodied males were more likely to migrate. And then both of these effects also interacted with colony size. So colony size, basically the larger a colony was, the stronger these effects were. The more males were more likely to remain resident, and the more larger bodied males were more likely than smaller bodied males to remain resident. However, looking at other potential individual correlates of migration, we found that characteristics that vary from year to year, like condition and reproductive success, were not particularly important in predicting migration. And actually, individuals were pretty consistent in their migratory strategies between years. So they showed really high fidelity, not only to their winter sites, but also to the routes that they used. So this is just 3 examples with year 1 in blue and year 2 in pink, showing how birds were basically following the same routes and wintering the same sites between years. And this was true across all the birds that we looked at. So moving on to the next question. So how did these differences that we observed between individuals affect their exposure to risk factors? So the particular risk factor that we're interested in was exposure to oil. And this was because we did some side tracking work during the refugio oil spill in California in 2015 and found that even sublethal oiling, so birds that had been oiled and rehabilitated and successfully released, affected movement patterns over the short term, so over the next year or so. So we found that birds that had been oiled and rehabilitated had longer migrations and didn't return to breeding sites during the next year. And we found that these differences were more significant in females than in males. So again, females seem to be more sensitive in some ways and more likely to move further away from colonies in cases in which conditions are suboptimal. So we created a layer to look at the exposure to oil via both shipping traffic and ports, as well as oil platforms and pipelines. And we overlaid that with preferred habitat that we derived from the tracking data using several different environmental covariates. And what we found was that there are these hotspots where individuals are exposed to high levels of oil and are overlapping with highly preferred habitats that are relatively stable in time. And they tend to concentrate around the mouths of rivers, which are very productive, low salinity habitats with a lot of prey availability for these species. And we found that there was both temporal and individual variation in exposure to oiling. So oiling, overlap was highest early in the breeding season and then peaked again during the migration period. It was higher in males than in females due to their resident behavior. They were staying in areas with higher levels of oil overlap during the year compared to females. And we found higher overlap, as you might expect, in those central and western areas with higher levels of offshore energy development compared to eastern breeders. So here we see both sex-based differences and also geographic differences in individual risk that are mediated by these movement patterns that we see. And just an interesting note on overlap between these breeding sites. So you have in green birds that are breeding in the western part of the Gulf, in orange birds that are breeding in the central part of the Gulf, and in blue birds that are breeding in the east. The only spot where all three of these populations or planning areas overlapped was in the Mississippi Delta. And this was during the post-breeding migration period. And if that area looks familiar, it's because it's right offshore is where the Deepwater Horizon oil spill occurred. So this is important for conservation purposes in that it shows that the individuals that are being affected by an event, a spatially concentrated event, are not necessarily local breeders. So understanding how to then mitigate damages from an event like an oil spill requires really understanding what the affected population is, which requires a detailed understanding of migration and how that varies across the range. So moving on to this third question, how do migratory movements contribute to population structure? So we used a network analysis to look at population structure based on movements between locations by individuals. So in the case of our analysis, the nodes within the network are these locations, are entities, and edges are the connections between the nodes. So we created a spatial network of sites that were used by clustering individual locations and using those as nodes. And we weighted the edges or the movements between the nodes by the number of individuals moving directly between them. So these colors represent modules within the network. So you can look at how closely connected different nodes are to one another compared to their connections to the overall network. And what we see, so a highly modular network, which would be a high level of migratory connectivity, would be closer to 1, and a low level of modularity would be closer to 0, and ours was 0.54. So given that you'd hardly ever see, a network that's perfectly connected, as in that example on the left-hand side, 0.54 is actually pretty high. So this indicates strong migratory connectivity within the overall eastern population. And we have 4 different, basically, units within the population. So one in the Western and Central Gulf, one in the Eastern Gulf, and basically the Florida Panhandle migrating down to Western Cuba, one along the Atlantic coast of Florida and down into, migrating down into the central part of Cuba, and then one in basically Maryland and North Carolina migrating down into Florida. So there's actually some good evidence that maybe the population delineations that were made during the delisting process actually have some validity in terms of how individuals are moving. So this is good information. So just to conclude, so in pelicans, we found that the factors contributing to migratory decisions primarily were geographic distribution, sex, body size, and local population density. We didn't find much of an effective condition or reproductive success, and we didn't really get to test out any effects of age or genetics. So these are sort of potential directions for future work. and how migration mediates individual exposure to risk. So we found that there were differential levels of risk across space as well as between sexes, and these could have potential effects on condition and future breeding success, as well as future distribution, based on what we know about how sublethal oiling can affect pelicans. And finally, how do migratory movements contribute to population structure? Well, we found that there was a pretty high level of migratory connectivity within the eastern population for this species. All right, moving on to the next example. So this is sea ducks, and I'm saying sea ducks generally. I'll mainly be focusing on black scoters, but I'll give a few examples that involve several different species of sea ducks. So in general, sea ducks are harvested species. So there's an interest in understanding how to define populations to ensure that harvest isn't differentially affecting different groups of sea ducks. And a lot of these are very numerous species. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, sometimes numerous species can decline by a lot, and you really miss those declines because they remain so numerous. So that's the case with sea ducks. There's sort of an anecdotal sense that their populations are declining, but it's very difficult to quantify that because their distributions are pretty remote throughout the year. They breed in very remote Arctic and subarctic habitats and winter offshore in the marine environment. So they're hard to really accurately quantify. And they have these really interesting and complex migration patterns. So they migrate separately, not just from a breeding to a non-breeding site, but they have these intermediate steps where they're migrating to spring staging and fall molt and staging sites that seem to be really important to the birds. And the fall molt is a flightless period for sea ducks, so they simultaneously molt all their flight feathers and they're basically immobile. So this is a period of really elevated vulnerability and seems to be a period where they're very faithful to specific molt sites that have good energetic characteristics and good protection from predators. So the main goals of the work that I'm going to be presenting are looking at population delineation, assessing potential risk factors, and prioritizing habitat areas. And the data set I worked with for this was the Atlantic and Great Lakes Sea Duck Migration Study. So this is a project managed by the Sea Duck Joint Venture and involved captures of multiple species of sea ducks at sea during the non-breeding period and implantation of platform terminal satellite transmitters. And this resulted in multi-year location data dating back to about 2001 for the earliest examples up until the present day. Across 5 different species of sea ducks. So we have long-tailed ducks, surf scoters, white-winged scoters, black scoters, and common eiders. And again, as I mentioned, I'll mostly be focusing on black scoters in this part of the talk as kind of as an example, but we do have some information from those other species as well. So looking at those same 3 questions, I'll mostly focus on the first and third question here. So what factors contribute to migratory decisions, and how do migratory movements in these species contribute to population structure? So looking at just the black scoter here, first of all, these are just the migratory routes of the species in spring on the left-hand side and in fall on the right-hand side. You can see right away that they're using different routes during the 2 seasons. So their migratory movements are different depending on the season. And their migration distances are actually longer by about 500 kilometers in spring. And the reason for this is they're using different primary staging areas. So I mentioned those spring staging and fall staging and molt areas that are pretty important for sea ducks. So in the spring, 99% of the black scoters that we tracked passed through the St. Lawrence estuary. This appears to be a really critical spring staging site for this species. And in fall, 84% passed through James Bay. So they're very highly coordinated. You can see that these migration tracks, there's not a lot of variability in them. And they're really dependent on these particular spring and fall staging sites. So we found that there were seasonal differences as well as sex-specific differences in site fidelity. So this graph shows the distance between a site that's used during a given season in one year versus the site that was used in the previous year for females in pink, males in blue, and then comparing the site to all other birds, like so the average of all other birds in the population in yellow. So we see that throughout the year, females and males both wintered and bred and staged closer to their previously used sites compared to the average of all the rest of the population. However, there were sex-specific differences. So during pre-breeding, post-breeding, and winter, females were actually a little bit further from their previous sites and males a little bit closer. But during breeding, that relationship reversed. So females were on average about 3 kilometers from their previous breeding sites, so highly site faithful during breeding. Males averaged about 60 kilometers, so there's a little bit more of a tendency to move around between sites. And both of these were very much closer to their previous sites than average of other random birds in the population. So there does seem to be this kind of fidelity to specific sites and routes within individuals, like we saw with the pelicans, where there's not a whole lot of variation between years. So looking at carrying over into spatial segregation, we also saw some differences between the sexes. So this is just the locations used during winter, and I overlaid some clusters to show the main kind of wintering areas that the scoters are using. And we found for those kind of middle wintering areas from southern New England down through Chesapeake Bay, we're about 50-50 males and females. So there wasn't really any differential use of those sites. But when you look at the more peripheral sites up in Atlantic Canada and down in the South Atlantic Bight, so we had a higher proportion of males, although very few individuals. So take that with a grain of salt. Much higher proportion of males using the northern sites and a much higher proportion of females using the southern sites. So going back to the kind of parallels with the pelican example, there does seem to be a tendency of males to be distributed a little bit further north during winter compared to females. Going forward into the spring migration season, we see these sex differences kind of carry over. So again, at the site that's being used the most frequently in the St. Lawrence estuary, the distribution was about 50-50 between males and females. But looking at these peripheral sites, we see sorry, that should be reversed. More females than males stopping over at all of these other sites. And that's because females use more stopover sites during their migration in general than males did. However, those differences disappear once we get to breeding. So breeding was about obviously 50-50 males and females. You can't really have one breeding without the other across the full range of the species. And then once we get into post-breeding, we have this interesting segregation that happens between birds that were successful in raising chicks and birds that were unsuccessful in raising chicks. So again, at the most commonly used site there in James Bay, we have about 50-50 successful and unsuccessful breeders. However, looking over at sites along the Atlantic coast, were predominantly used by breeders that either were unsuccessful or just didn't breed at all. So these tend to be, non-breeders or failed breeders. Versus molt and fall staging sites in further west in Hudson Bay were used primarily by successful breeders. So this is a different kind of segregation from what we see in other parts of the year, but is interesting because we found that the best predictor of breeding successfully, just based on staying at a breeding site long enough to raise chicks, was having bred successfully in a previous year. So individuals seem to vary in terms of their ability to successfully raise chicks. And so if we have sites where more successfully breeding females are concentrated during this vulnerable molt period, those could be particularly important for conservation if you're looking to conserve the individuals that are most likely to contribute to future population growth. And besides the spatial segregation, we also saw some sex-based segregation temporally, and I'll explain a little bit about that. So I'll kind of break this figure down for you since there's a lot going on. Looking at the pre-breeding stage, so we have males in the darker color, females in the lighter color here. We had 2 peaks in movement, so that's the movement to the spring staging sites and then the movement to the breeding sites that are pretty similar between males and females. So there's not a lot of temporal differences here in the spring. However, once we get into post-breeding, we see there's this really distinct difference between when males are moving around away from the breeding sites, which is much earlier from when females are moving away from the breeding sites. So if you know sea ducks at all, males don't stick around. They're not a biparental care species. The females really do all the work. The males are just there at the start of the breeding season and then move straight to their post-breeding staging and molt sites. So there's actually about a little over a month of difference between when males leave the breeding site and move to staging and molt sites and when females do. So although they're using the same site spatially post-breeding, they're pretty strongly segregated temporally. So females are spending a lot longer on the breeding sites and are a lot more tied to those sites versus males spending a lot longer on the post-breeding sites. But then once we get to the the end of the post-breeding migration into the wintering period, they kind of catch up. So females and males are arriving at winter sites at about the same time. So really it's just during that post-breeding period that there's this pretty strong spatial temporal segregation between sexes. And what that results in, as I mentioned, is a lot longer duration of stay at breeding sites for the females versus a lot longer duration of stay at post-breeding sites for the males. So moving on to population structure. So I'm going to present something a little bit similar to with the pelicans. So first of all, looking at migratory connectivity. So this is just, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, this is, how close are individuals to one another during breeding, and do these spatial relationships carry over into the wintering grounds? Are individuals that are closer together on breeding sites staying closer together on wintering sites? And with black scoters, we found that that wasn't the case. So there's very low connectivity between wintering and breeding sites. But as I mentioned, sea ducks have these non-direct migrations. So they're not going straight from wintering to breeding sites. They're stopping over on both legs of the journey at staging sites. And what we found was that there's connectivity between the wintering and spring staging and between the breeding and fall molt sites was actually pretty high, both spatially and temporally. So individuals that were closer together during wintering were also closer together during spring staging and arrived closer together in time. And the same was true between breeding and fall molt and staging. But between spring staging and breeding sites and between fall molt and wintering sites, there was pretty low spatial and temporal connectivity. So this indicates that there could be populations that are during certain periods of the year that are kind of growing and developing into these like separate units that persist over a certain period of time and then kind of come back together. So thinking about the effects of something like hunting that's very specific in time and pretty much restricted to the fall migration period, this could present opportunities for there to be some differential effects where individuals that are being targeted in specific portions of their fall staging range are also coming from specific portions of the breeding range. And so this is a similar sort of modularity analysis to what I presented for the pelicans. So just looking at how the overall movement network for sea ducks is structured. And this was for all 5 of the species that we did this analysis. So 3 scoter species plus common eiders and long-tailed ducks. So we looked at the entire basically Eastern and Great Lakes populations for these birds and found a pretty low level of modularity, both across the multi-species network and across individuals. So they're not really grouping in any way in the East. They're kind of all intermixing. So we integrated some data from the Pacific to see how at a continental level, these kind of the patterns played out. So looking at black scoters are very distinct between their Eastern and Western populations. And they grouped up basically into 2 populations, as you might expect in the Pacific and the Eastern United States. However, when we look at surf scoters, they actually overlapped in their breeding range, but they still basically grouped into an Eastern and a Pacific group. With white-winged scoters, we saw basically kind of an Alaskan group, a Pacific group, and an Eastern group. And when you combine these 3 together into a multi-species network, we had basically 4 distinct groups. And this was a level of modularity of about 0.53, so pretty high as well. And the reason that this is interesting is because sea ducks and other waterfowl are managed using a flyway system. So we have the Pacific flyway, the Central flyway, the Mississippi flyway, and the Atlantic flyway. And what you can see is, at least for sea ducks, the actual movement of the actual populations as determined by migratory movement don't match up at all with the flyways. So we have an Eastern population that basically spans the 3 Eastern flyways, and a Pacific population that has a much less sort of coordinated movement, much more individual variation in migratory pathways, and kind of different groups of individuals within even this Pacific flyway that come out in the migration analysis that are more connected to one another than to the overall group. So this is a pretty good indicator that sea ducks aren't really suited to the flyway management system. They don't really undertake kind of north-south migrations. And there's a lot of individual sort of variation within the population that creates these units that are connected to one another that aren't captured by the flyway management system at all. So to conclude, looking at which factors contributed to migratory decisions in sea ducks, we see geography and sex, so similar to pelicans, but also an effect of reproductive success, which we didn't really see in pelicans, showing up with sea ducks. And we see an effect of time. So there's temporal segregation that's happening, particularly between sexes, that's contributing to really different distributions across the year. And then looking at how migratory movements contribute to population structure, again, similar to pelicans, we see a pretty strong structuring of the population using migration. And again, we have this temporal component where, individuals are moving in, at different times of the year and having different levels of connectivity with other individuals that are moving at similar times. So this contributes to some of the importance of understanding these movements to structuring hunting and harvest regulations, is also understanding how individuals are moving in time and what group of individuals is present at any given time to be harvested. So those are, my two examples, and I'm happy to talk more about them, but I also want to take a moment to introduce the talks that are coming up in this symposium that are going to give you a lot of different facets into the many different ways in which migration can vary among individuals that I've only really touched on here. So we're starting out with Camilla Carnero, who's going to be talking about Icelandic whimbrels and actually looking at how individual fitness is affected by migratory movements. Moving on to Alex Anderson, who's going to be talking about the effects of drought on multi-species shorebird communities during migration, which is obviously really interesting in light of changing environmental conditions and changing conditions in wetlands. We're going to hear from Marlee Akins, who's going to be talking about using Motus tracking, which is a really exciting miniaturized tracking technology using antennas that'll be tracking semi-palmated sandpipers and looking at their migrations. We're going to hear from Patrick Donnelly, who's looking at networks of stopover sites in interior wetlands for sandhill cranes. And then finally, we're going to hear from Laura McDuffie, who's going to give us an annual cycle perspective on migration in the declining lesser yellowlegs. So across a variety of different taxa and a variety of different questions and a variety of different kind of aspects of individual variation, this symposium is, I think, going to give us some really interesting insights into what drives individual variation in migration and how that individual variation scales up to a population level effect and varies with environmental conditions. So with that, these are two very huge projects and have a lot of people to thank. And so I will mainly thank, Patrick Jodas, who's here on this call, who is involved with the Pelican work, and Scott McWilliams and Peter Payton, who were instrumental in the sea duck work, and everyone else who contributed data. And I haven't been able to look at the time, so I don't really know where I am in terms of questions, but thank you all for being here and for listening. And I really appreciate the chance to share this with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Juliet. We have plenty of time for questions. I echo some of the comments already in the chat that was an excellent talk, and such a great overview of the issues. And then the data that you presented are just fantastic in terms of breaking some of the paradigms in terms of flyways with ducks. And so really, really appreciate the talk. And so let me see what sort of, everybody's been saying it's a great talk, but if there are any questions, please put them in the chat, or you can actually raise your hand with the reaction button if you'd like. We can take a look at that. Several people have said how wonderfully visualized as well. So, but absolutely true. The graphics were fantastic.
Okay, Dave has his hand raised.
Okay, Dave.
Hey, Juliet, that was freaking amazing. That was great. I was just wondering your thoughts on, like, you can really see the value of these approaches to identifying critical areas for populations or species. But I was just wondering about your thoughts about the value of integrating this kind of data to looking at communities or guilds of birds and prioritizing conservation based on overlap of critical areas and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally. I didn't get to present much on the multi-species sea duck work, but one of the really cool things with those networks that I presented is that you can actually, like, once you have migration sites arranged into a network, you can do all this really cool quantitative stuff, like measuring, like if you take a site out of the network, how does that affect migratory connectivity and, energetics and things like that. So one of the things you can do with that, if you have a multi-species network, is to identify species whose use of the network kind of makes them a good umbrella for other species. And that was one of the things we did with sea ducks. So we looked at those 5 different species to see of all of the species, which one kind of represented the most important sites within the network. And we found actually long-tailed ducks were a really good umbrella species potentially for the others because they're pretty generalist and they occur kind of across the range of the other species. So yeah, that's a really good point because conservation usually isn't single species. I mean, in some cases it is when you have the luxury to do that, but usually it's kind of site-based and you're trying to maximize the value across a range of species. So having this kind of long-term individual data from multiple different species offers these opportunities to take a more community-focused approach and to actually like integrate data across multiple species and figure out how to prioritize sites with, you know, multi-species conservation in mind. So yeah, really good point.
So there's a question from Pat Jodis. Is there a threshold of data that these network analyses require? I can see lots of people being interested in this, but wondering if they have enough information.
I mean, I think you can construct a network with pretty minimal data. Obviously, having more data, you know, allows you to ask better questions, but basically, the way that I think about networks is they're just analyses of pairwise relationships, which is what you're doing whenever you're analyzing a movement data set anyway. Like you have movements between pairs of points. That's like the basic unit of what you're doing. So I think even for small data sets, and especially if you have kind of a spatial structure in mind, if you're looking at use of a bunch of different protected areas or different stopover sites, if there's kind of a pre-existing spatial structure on the landscape, a network analysis can be a really good tool to start kind of putting a quantitative side to that and figuring out like which of these sites are more important given what we know about movements. And then once you have a network built, you can actually keep kind of adding data into it as you get more data from different species, from, you know, more years of transmitter data. So I think it's fairly easy to put into place and it's pretty powerful and it's something that can kind of grow and evolve as your tracking program grows and evolves.
Okay, thank you. So you basically would recommend starting it with whatever data you have, and then
I think so, yeah. I think at least kind of thinking in those terms, thinking about, you know, what are my units in the network? What am I interested in? And then starting to kind of, you know, put the tracking data into that framework can be a really helpful exercise, even if you have pretty limited data.
Okay, Prakar Rawal asks a question. Is management of flyways the best optimal way to conserve migratory species, given that species might deviate, as you've shown, from the standard flyways?
I mean, I think that I don't want to trash flyways at all. I think they can be a very useful tool for kind of summarizing, like as Dave said, you know, we're not talking necessarily about trying to conserve every single species one at a time. We're talking about, you know, maximizing conservation across a suite of species. And I think in that way, flyways can be a really powerful way of kind of simply describing how large groups of species move across the landscape and what are kind of the similarities between them. But at the same time, I think understanding where the flyway system might fall apart for certain groups of species is also really important. So yeah, in the case of sea ducks, it seems kind of logical that, you know, a flyway system that's based on terrestrial waterfowl might not work for waterfowl that are breeding inland and then using coastal habitats during non-breeding, but actually kind of putting, you know, the analysis together to show that as important to understanding, like this is a gap in how, you know, how this group of birds is managed, because here's a group that's not doing the same thing as everyone else. So yeah, I think that, you know, flyways are useful, but also understanding where they might not work as well is really important to understanding what their limitations are.
Okay, and there's a comment from Dave that this talk reinforces for me the real value of integrating individual tracking studies within species and the opportunity of collaborative approaches for understanding broad scale patterns and connectivity. Maybe you could just mention a little bit the importance of the collaborations that you had in terms of.
Well, I was going to say I think probably several reviewer on this paper that came out recently, and I think it was Science that was looking at this new data set on MoveBank that's integrating tracking data across a bunch of different Arctic species. I think that, you know, now that we're getting into not only being able to collect more telemetry data, but also be able to share it more easily, having kind of a collaborative and open approach to integrating data with different collaborators across different systems and species is like kind of the next frontier in migration research. And I think generally my experience has been people are really open to collaboration. Like the papers I presented with sea ducks probably have about 20 or 30 authors that are mostly just, you know, data collaborators, but that contribute substantially to the work as well. And, you know, creating those networks, developing those networks, having things like joint ventures that actually can fund work across these networks are super important. And, you know, just going out and putting transmitters on 5 birds at one site and publishing that isn't really going to work anymore. And it's some kind of, in some cases, yes, like if you've got, 60 herons, like obviously 5 is going to make a huge difference. But for these species where we're starting to get really big data, we can ask these questions only if we're willing to collaborate at a large scale. So yeah, that's been really crucial in my work, and I think really crucial moving forward as well.
Okay, and somebody says, thanks again for a great talk. Natasha says this, you mentioned how these individual differences impacted exposure to risk. Have these differences been linked to individual variation in fitness, demography?
So that's really the next step. And I mean, if you remember the pyramid that I showed early in the talk, right, it's finding, first of all, linking populations, which is kind of the first step that I was on. And then the next step from there is figuring out vital rates across the annual cycle and trying to identify limiting periods. So we still do have some ways to go, like figuring out what the populations are and what individuals are doing is kind of step one. And then going back and getting that detailed demographic data that can kind of figure out what the consequences of that variation is the next step. So yeah, I think we're not, at least with these projects that I talked about, we're not there yet. And it might be some time before we get there, but at least we have kind of a starting point that we know what we're looking for based on kind of population delineation.
Well, you did mention the fact that black scoters, the ones that were reproducing more were migrating from places. So that's a fitness consequence, right?
Yeah, but even then, this is data that's coming from the transmitters because they're reproducing in such remote areas that we can't actually go in and see, are they really raising chicks successfully? What's happening to those chicks once they leave the nest? So there's, that's kind of a minimum like baseline value of whether or not they're reproducing successfully. But yeah, there's a lot of challenges in collecting that kind of demographic data that I think are going to be hard to overcome for some species, but that's really, really what we're trying to get to.
Yes, and some of the talks that we're going to hear today will actually try to speak to that as well.
Excellent.
So that's good. So I think we will take a 5-minute break before we start with the first speaker, so we stay on track. And thank you again, Juliet, for this fantastic introduction to the symposium and a fantastic presentation about this whole issue and two wonderful case studies that actually are just right on target. So thank you so much, Juliet. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Erica, for putting the symposium together. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the talks.
And thank you too for introducing all the new speakers. I appreciate that. Okay, so I'll meet you everybody back in 3 minutes.
Chris, are you on?
Yes.
I don't know if you understood my message about the waiting room.
No. I mean, I guess I didn't actually see it.
So if you, at the bottom of the participants list, when you have the participant list open,
Okay,
there might be 3 dots.
right.
If you click on that, is there something that says like automatically ding or notify when there's somebody in the waiting room?
Yes. So, okay, I didn't uncheck that because I wanted to hear the ding so I could admit people, but I can uncheck that.
Try that, because usually I thought that only allows you to hear it, but we're all hearing it. It was a little distracting during Juliet's talk.
Right. Okay, so I've unchecked it. So
Okay,
if it,
we'll see if
yeah, if I still have to, if I don't hear the dings, I'll just pay more attention at the upper part of my screen to get people in quickly.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure why it's doing that, but thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you. That's great to get rid of that.
I think Juliet has to give a workshop on how to effectively communicate science. That was freaking amazing.
Yes, she could give a workshop on the networking too, and all sorts of things. Yes, it was pretty amazing.
He gave a plenary at the PSG in early 2020. It was the last, conference I went to in person on that topic.
Oh, on the networking or on?
No, on social communication of science.
Wow.
Which was another fantastic talk.
Okay, we will get started with this symposium. And first of all, I would like to thank all of the speakers in the symposium. I'll do that at the end as well, but for volunteering to contribute to this important work. The other thing I may apologize for, because I do study shorebirds myself, is that it is shorebird heavy, but I think shorebirds are quite diverse, and so kind of are model organisms for showing the diversity of these sorts of factors. So the first speaker in today's symposium, or the second speaker actually after Juliet, is Camilo Carneiro. He's from the South Iceland Research Center in Iceland, and he will be speaking on the migration of Icelandic whimbrels, recent findings, and fitness consequences. So over to you, Camilo.
Okay, thank you, Erika, for the introduction. Yeah, and hello, everyone. So as you said, my name is Camilo Carneiro. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the South Iceland Research Center, where I started recently looking into trophic interactions between whimbrel chicks and their food resources. But during the following minutes, I will actually talk about some of the findings made during my PhD, when I was looking at how different annual strategies might link into different fitness outputs or fitness consequences. To give you a bit of a context, whimbrels are long-distance migratory waders, which breed mostly in the subarctic and spend the winter along coasts of tropical and temperate areas. Whimbrels tend to be faithful to their breeding and wintering sites. Their IUCN classification is of least concern, but some populations are actually declining, and they are certainly not free of threats. In Iceland, we have a subspecies, we call it Icelandic whimbrel. They breed all over the country, but mostly in the lowlands and in the south. Their migratory behavior became more clear in the last decade, after we started tracking them with geolocators, which started in 2012. And now we have a good picture of their migration routes, and here you can see what they do in autumn. So what we know is that nearly all of the times they leave Iceland and they fly non-stop in a direct flight to the wintering sites. I say nearly, although here I mention 100% of the times, because since we produced this figure, we of course continued tracking birds, and we got a couple of them actually stopping in autumn, but still this figure is about 100%. Also, their wintering locations are not only in West Africa, as you see here, but they also extend a bit further south and further north up to the Iberian Peninsula. In spring, they can do the same, but in reverse. They can fly straight to Iceland, as you can see by these dashed green lines on both of the maps. But most often than not, they actually move to a stopover location stay there 1-2 weeks and then move to Iceland. And these stopover locations are mostly in Ireland and the UK, but also along the coast of Western Europe. We also asked what are their seasonal, if there are any seasonal differences in spring duration and speed in the system. And to do that, we took into account the first fueling period by assuming a certain fuel deposition rate and calculating how long individuals would take to fuel up for the first flight. And we found that in autumn, Icelandic whimbrels make shorter migrations in terms of duration than in spring. And likewise, their autumn migration speed is higher in autumn than in spring. We didn't find any differences in these variables between sexes and also their routes. I didn't mention before, they didn't differ between sexes or their timings. They don't differ. Statistically, we don't find significant difference in their timings, but males tend to be later than females in autumn and earlier in spring. These differences between seasons in speed, they are curious because a faster autumn migration is not common among birds, but at least in Icelandic whimbrels, it could arise due to several factors. For example, it could be that the arrival order into the wintering areas is important. As I mentioned, they are site faithful and territorial in the winter, so it might be important to arrive early to maintain or acquire a good wintering spot. Perhaps we see those differences because they are a reflection of different wind conditions during flights. The stopover, which certainly adds to the duration of spring migration, could happen so that birds can improve their body condition prior arrival at the breeding sites, or it could also be that they stop in order to assess the weather conditions at the breeding sites before they make the final move. I will come back to some of these points later, but first I would like to show you how consistent Icelandic whimbrels are in their migration. And I would like to start by their spring migration behavior. As I mentioned, they have these two contrasting behaviors, which is either a direct flight to Iceland or a flight to stopover location and then another flight to Iceland to resume migration. And we tracked the same individuals over multiple years, and we managed to get 12 birds with repeated spring migrations, and 3 out of those 12 birds changed between these two behaviors in spring. But what's more intriguing, at least for me, is that this change was, it only happened in one direction. So we only saw birds changing from a direct behavior to a stopover behavior. We also looked at their consistency in terms of timings, and the metric I will show you is the mean individual range, which is essentially the difference between the maximum and the minimum individual timing for a given annual stage, and then averaged across the sample. And in autumn, we saw that Icelandic whimbrels tend to depart. Each individual tends to depart within a window of about 9 days, and then the arrival dates tend to vary in the same magnitude because they make a direct flight, so this is expected. In spring, however, they are much more consistent, and they tend to depart from the wintering sites within a window of about 4 days. But again, because they can the same individuals can do a direct flight or a stopover flight, then we see a more variation on the arrival dates. And so, yeah, we have these two spring migration behaviors, which are quite contrasting. And so we were wondering what drives these behaviors. And we tested 3 ideas. We thought first that, okay, perhaps birds leave the wintering sites, and depending on the conditions that they experience along the first flight, they might then stop or not. To test that, we looked at the wind conditions they experience until they cross 42 degrees north. And we calculated, well, we use this variable, which is the air to ground speed ratio, which informs on the wind support, essentially. And we would expect that birds that travel all of this distance and experience worse conditions would be more likely to stop. But when we compared the two groups, we were surprised to see that they did not differ. We thought that, okay, maybe they actually assess some other conditions when they are getting closer to Iceland. And so we compared the temperature at this latitude for the two groups. And again, we failed to find any differences. So we tested another idea, which was that, okay, perhaps they are flying over the Atlantic, and when they reach this region of the Atlantic, they are pushed literally by westerly winds to stop. So we looked at the zonal wind that individuals experience when crossing this latitudinal window you see in the image. But again, we didn't see any differences. And actually what happens is that they tend to experience more westward winds than eastward winds. So we looked at another thing, and we thought, okay, perhaps they define their migratory behavior at departure or before departure. And when we looked at the departure date between the two groups, we actually found a difference in which birds that migrate directly, they tend to depart later than birds that are going to make a stopover. And since we see birds departing later, making a direct flight, well, they will save on the stopover duration, and this might hint into the need to arrive early into the breeding sites, which tends to be important at high latitudes in order to lay early, because the season is usually short. So we looked at how the laying date varies with the arrival date, and we found a positive relationship. Indeed, for whimbrels in Iceland, the earlier they arrive, the earlier they tend to lay their clutches. But we were interested to know if actually these timings and the spring strategies or spring behaviors in migration would affect their breeding success. So we checked how the fledging success, or if the fledging success varies with laying dates, and we found out that it does. So for Icelandic whimbrels, the earlier they lay their clutches, the higher is the probability of being successful breeders. So at first it seems there is a link between strategies or behaviors in spring and timings in spring and their breeding success. But if we look better at this plot, we see that indeed birds following a direct behavior arrive earlier than those that make a stopover. But the laying date is not really different. There's a huge overlap. So it's actually not clear that a direct behavior has a benefit in terms of breeding timings. And we also failed to find differences in weather conditions experienced during the flights between the two behaviors. So why is it that a stopover is so common? And our idea is that individuals of our population stop in order to fine-tune their arrival timing at the breeding sites. As you can see, and as I mentioned, the main stopover site is in Ireland and the UK, which is basically the last land where they can stop before arriving at the breeding sites. And it's relatively close. So they might be able to assess weather conditions and only move when these conditions are favorable, and therefore decrease the probability of facing stochastic weather events, such as a huge snowfall, for example, early in the season. To see if that would even be possible, we looked we looked for how the temperature in the breeding site, or if the temperature in the breeding site correlates with the temperature in the stopover site at departure for the birds that we were tracking. And we found that it does. So Icelandic whimbrels, they might indeed be be able, or at least it's possible, that they can assess the weather conditions at the breeding sites while they are at the stopover sites, and then fine-tune their timing of arrival. So there seem to be advantages of making a stopover, but one thing that keeps crossing my mind is this thing that we only found individuals changing from a direct flight to a stopover flight. And this makes me think that perhaps the spring strategy is learned in this system. And now I will just speculate a lot, but I will take the opportunity to do it, and perhaps you have different ideas, and I would really appreciate if you can share them with me. So all the data I found was collected on adult birds, so birds that and adults that we don't know the age. They could be 4 years old or 14. But if we think of a young whimbrel that leaves Iceland for the first time, perhaps it's fair to assume that it will do what adults do, since they all do the same, which is a direct flight to the wintering sites. And if imagine a juvenile that does this, this bird will have no idea of the existence of Western Europe. It spends the first summer in Iceland. When it's time to leave, perhaps this bird will be relatively late because it's an inexperienced individual. And as we saw, late birds tend to make a direct flight. So this bird could possibly do that and still have no knowledge about the opportunity to stop along the way. It comes back to, it breeds, comes back to the wintering sites. And in the following spring or a few years later, if it repeats what it did before, perhaps they advance their timings as they mature, eventually join a flock of older birds or more experienced birds. It finds that stopover is an option and starts finding. And as I said, this is, well, a lot of speculation, and we can't test most of these things, but we actually started tracking juveniles this year. And out of those that left Iceland, they all made autumn migration similar to those of adults. So indeed, so far they have no knowledge of the existence of stopovers in Western Europe. And with that, I will stop my presentation, but I would like to thank all the funding agencies that allowed for this research to happen, the conference organizers for allowing me to share the results, and everyone for listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Camilo. That was a wonderful presentation. And let me see what kind of questions arise here. Allie, go ahead.
Yeah, very, very cool study, Camilo. I'm interested in knowing if at their wintering sites, are there other whimbrels from other places that are stopping there as well? Because one thing I was wondering could be like maybe a proportion departs with other whimbrels that are heading like perhaps more northeast instead of to Iceland, and so a proportion goes with those birds and then continues on, or is it fairly separate? There's not really other breeding populations that are going to the wintering area.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, they certainly overlap, the wintering locations, they certainly overlap with the nominate subspecies, with which goes the other way. So that's absolutely, yeah, it's an option as well, of course. But yeah, I don't know what's the proportion of other subspecies per wintering areas. I suspect it's not completely balanced. I think in the main place where Icelandic whimbrels go in the winter are the mangroves and huge mudflats in in Guinea-Bissau and Guinea-Conakry. And I think there it will be mostly those birds indeed. But further north, I suspect there will be more of the nominate subspecies. But yeah, that could possibly be that. I mean, this is just an idea, and that's totally possible, of course. And it could also be that they will stop because it's innate somehow. But yeah, I'm not sure if I actually answered your question or not.
Okay, we have another question too in the chat. How long do birds stop over? And is it possible that there's some resource available at the stopover site, which is available during the early days and may only be required by a fraction of the population? Have you made observations at the stopover site?
I didn't work at the stopover sites. They do vary in the time they stop, and late birds, they tend to stop less. They tend to stop shorter periods. It's possible that that's one of the possibilities, that they stop because the fueling opportunities, so they gather more food per time there than in Iceland if they move directly to Iceland. That's one possibility. But because late birds tend to spend less time, I think it also hints to this suggestion that they are fine-tuning their timing of arrival in Iceland. I don't know if that makes sense or if it answers the question, but anyway, everyone is, please feel free to email me or write me on Slack or on the chat. I'm happy to discuss further, of course.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your talk. And unfortunately, we have to move on to the next speaker. Okay, so the next speaker is Ali Anderson, who asked a question now. And Ali is a postdoctoral fellow, or doing a postdoc at Smithsonian Institute, but actually did her thesis work at Trent University, my institution. And she is going to give a talk called Drought at Coastal Wetland Affects Refueling and Migration Strategies of Shorebirds. So go ahead, Ali.
Just getting my screen shared here, one moment. Oh, that's not what I want to do. Okay, hi everyone. Happy to talk with you today about this work I did as part of my PhD. So many of you will be familiar with shorebirds and their stopover ecology, but I'll do a little bit of a brief overview before getting into this idea of drought. So shorebirds, as many of you know, their populations have declined recently. In the last 70 years, many of the populations have gone down by about 40 to 70%. Those declines tend to be higher for the longer distance migrants. And declines can be attributed to a variety of different things. In some places it's unclear, but could be habitat loss, human disturbance, climate change, a variety of different aspects. And today I'll talk about the potential of maybe some of that being related to drought or changes in climate at key stopover sites. So as Juliet gave a really lovely overview about the different life stages of birds and where they're going and the different threats that they could encounter at different sites. Shorebirds, of course, this is true as well. Many are migrating very long distances, and during that time, many also rely on these key stopover sites. So these are Wissaran sites, they're Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network sites, and these are sites that have been identified as important for shorebirds during the stopover period. And declines of shorebirds could be attributed to changes in conditions at some of these sites. So one of the key examples of this for shorebirds in the Western Hemisphere is for red knots in Delaware Bay, and Delaware Bay, New Jersey is an important site for shorebirds, especially red knot on northbound migration. As they travel north up to their Arctic breeding grounds, they stop there and feed on the eggs of horseshoe crabs. And at Delaware Bay, red knot populations declined drastically in the early 2000s. And that's been largely attributed to a decline in their key prey item at that stopover site. So that was a decline in horseshoe crab eggs, particularly. So this is one example how even one individual site where a large proportion of a population aggregates can result in large population declines. Delaware Bay, there's a fairly well amount of information known about what shorebirds are doing at the sites and a large monitoring program, but other sites, especially some of these more northern stopover sites for shorebirds, are less well understood. And the site that I was working at was James Bay, Ontario, which is in the Canadian subarctic. And I was monitoring shorebirds on southbound migration there. So James Bay is also a key stopover site for many shorebirds. It's a very interesting site. We have the boreal forest kind of out to the west, and then the bay here, which is a part of the Atlantic Arctic Ocean. And so you get this intense mixing of sediment where a large proportion of fresh water flows out from what's considered to be the Hudson Bay lowlands, or a very wide wetland system that abuts the boreal forest. So this site is one of the first southbound stopover sites for shorebirds that breed in the Arctic and are traveling southbound. It is very important for birds to stop there to fatten and refuel so that they can put on enough weight to complete their migrations. And in James Bay, for some species and individuals, we can see individuals double their mass during a 2 to 3 week period at stopover. We also know that James Bay can support a large proportion of certain global populations. So for example, the red knot rufous subspecies, a master's student in our group, Amy McDonald, did her work at this site as well, and found that about a quarter of the global population of red knot stops at this area on southbound migration. So it is a very important site for shorebirds, especially shorebirds like white rump sandpiper and Hudsonian godwit, where this is one of the only stopover sites for these species in the Western Hemisphere. The work that I did was in Moose Cree traditional territory, so specifically the southwestern part of James Bay. And you can see here on this photo, this kind of thick strip, thick little white strip that is wide intertidal mudflats that exist in this portion of the coast of James Bay. So James Bay has experienced a lot of change in the last 30 to 40 years, and that coincides with some of these timing of shorebird population declines as well. We're unsure if this is related to climate change, but we do know that there are conditions that are changing there. Specifically, the indigenous people that live there have noticed changes in dryness in the region, especially the summers becoming more dry. And it's also been predicted scientifically that the summers and falls will become more dry in this region. And that could be important for shorebirds because the invertebrates that they feed on are usually emerge generally in the summer, and they build up over time into the fall when shorebirds arrive for stopover. So it's important to understand kind of some of these effects of drought on shorebirds in this area. I should note too that many of the studies of drought on shorebirds have focused specifically on shorebirds in the prairie pothole region of the Western Hemisphere. But it's also very true that drought does occur at some of these coastal sites and could have an impact on shorebirds as well. So through my PhD work, I did not intend to study drought on shorebirds. I worked with the James Bay Shorebird Project, which is coordinated by the Canadian Wildlife Service and a variety of other partners. And I was assessing shorebird diet and important habitats, but we had a year of field work where we noticed that there was a major drying event, or at least major from our personal view. So we would be out monitoring shorebirds, and we noticed that it was easy to walk through the marshes to get out to the coast. We would stay inland and we'd walk generally through with knee-high boots. And in this year, 2017, we could wear our hiking boots to walk out to the coast. There was also a reduction in some greenery in the area and a noticeable decline in the fresh water that was flowing out into the these wide intertidal mudflats. So because we were collecting this detailed data on shorebird migration and prey availability at the site, we were able to examine some of the effects of drought on shorebird stopover and foraging ecology, as well as migration. We also had access to a large data set of about 14 years of banding data on shorebird body mass that had been collected, that we could compare years with drier conditions to years with wetter conditions to see if this pattern between the 2 years also held up in more years in the area. So we had a variety of questions that we came up with when we were out there, and that was how does drought affect shorebirds' ability to put on body mass? Is it affecting the prey availability for shorebirds? What about the shorebirds' diets, the duration that they stay in James Bay, and whether that affects what they do after they depart James Bay on migration? And also we were monitoring a wide variety of shorebird species there. So we were interested to see if different species responded differently to these conditions. So the first thing we looked at was invertebrate abundance in both mudflat and intertidal marsh environments. So kind of that transition zone with vegetation that I showed in a photo earlier. In the year with average conditions, 2016, we looked at foraging sites and control sites. So sites where shorebirds were feeding, and then other possible suitable sites for shorebirds. We found consistently that the control sites had less prey, so shorebirds were finding more prey. But when we compared that to the year with moderate drought, we still saw shorebirds finding a high amount of prey sites, but the control sites had less prey available. So it's possible that drought was affecting the total amount of prey that was available in kind of the broader habitat there. We also found that shorebirds tended to have more diverse diets in the drier years. So we used DNA metabarcoding of shorebird fecal samples to look at the frequency of different prey families in the shorebird diet. And we found that shorebirds had more diverse diets in that drier year. And this was quite interesting to me. It could be that shorebirds are looking, or kind of in that drier year, if prey is less abundant, kind of just eating whatever is available to them as they find it, and maybe they're being less selective of prey items that they prefer. Still a bit unknown. We compared the refueling rates of shorebirds using plasma metabolites, and here I'm presenting results from plasma triglycerides. So these plasma triglycerides tend to go up as birds are putting on more weight or they're refueling more. So higher levels indicate higher rates of refueling. Here I'm just presenting the results for adults, but we had semi-palmated sandpiper and white rump sandpiper in 2 years. So 2016, the year with average conditions, 2017, the drier year. And we saw consistently, and this was true in both adults and for species of juveniles, all of the juveniles we looked at, that there were lower refueling rates in the drier year. So yes, we were finding drought affecting shorebird refueling. We were also monitoring shorebirds with automated radio telemetry. So we were applying tiny little nano tags and seeing where the birds moved, how long they stayed through the Motus Wildlife Tracking System. And through this, we were able to determine how long individuals stayed in James Bay. And we found that in the drier year, juveniles in particular, they tended to stay fewer days in James Bay. So again, here's the year with average conditions. Here's the drier year, moderate drought. And we saw consistently lower patterns of length of stay, fewer days. And in some cases, it was about half as long for juveniles. For adults, we did not see this pattern. We saw that adults stayed the same amount of time in both years. So again, we find some evidence that drought might be affecting the amount of time at least juveniles were staying in the region. We also compared, I should mention before I talk about this, that we also looked to see when a bird had left using our radio telemetry data, when they had departed James Bay, were they more likely to make a stop or not in North America? So the evidence we found was that in the drier year, that all species and age classes except for white rump sandpiper juveniles, or white rump sandpipers in general, we didn't have white rump sandpiper juveniles, but white rump sandpipers, that they were all more likely to make a subsequent stop in North America in the year with drought. So that may suggest that with the lower refueling rates, the birds might have to take more additional stops after they depart James Bay. So when we also wanted to see if this pattern held up in more years of data, and so we used shorebird body mass data to examine patterns in mass over different scenarios of wetness and dryness in the region. So we used the SPEI, which is a drought index where lower values equal years that are drier than average. 0 is the average conditions, and 1 is wetter years, years that are wetter than average. And we did this across 5 species and with different, with juveniles and adults. And we found consistent patterns across all of the species of higher birds having higher body mass in wetter years and lower body mass in drier years. And this seemed to hold up across all species and age classes, with the exception of least sandpiper juveniles. We didn't really see a pattern there. The amounts of body mass were not necessarily super different. In some cases, it was between a 2% difference in body mass in the years in James Bay, but in some cases it was up to a 9% difference in body mass. So we do find some relationship between drought and body mass in shorebirds in this area. So if we re-look at these kind of questions we had asked in the beginning, does drought affect shorebirds' body mass? We found evidence for that, yes. So birds tended to have lower body mass in drier years and lower refueling rates. Prey availability, we found some evidence of this. So we found lower invertebrate abundance in these control areas. So there might be less prey available in the environment overall. Diet, yes, we found higher diet diversity in the year with drought. Stopover duration, yes, shorter stopover duration for juveniles. Future stopover decisions, yes, for most species and age classes except white rump sandpiper, which I should mention there are the longest distance migrant we were working with. They travel all the way from James Bay all the way down to the southern tip of South America. And so they may have less flexibility in their migratory decisions. And does it affect species differently? A bit, with that exception of white rump sandpiper, but generally we found very similar patterns of lower refueling rate, patterns in mass across species. So overall, we found that short-term moderate drought can affect shorebird refueling. And I didn't mention this, but the drought we were looking at was summer into fall, so a 3-month drought period. And that seems to be affecting stopover and migration strategies of shorebirds at a major coastal stopover site. And that might be carrying over to affect what shorebirds do after they leave James Bay. We suggest that future studies continue to look at the role of drought, especially in shorebird population declines. Right now, we don't have evidence to link this to population declines, but it could be interesting to compare at other sites. And also see if this pattern is holding up at other coastal stopover sites for birds as well, with the possibility of climate changing and affecting water balance around the globe. And this project was very collaborative and involved a lot of partners and different research groups. So thank you to all of those who were part of this, including Erica Knoll, who is one of my supervisors. And I'll
Okay, thank you very much, Ali, for a really interesting and detailed talk. And we will accept questions now. There's a question. Now I'm a little confused about that's a question from the last one. Yeah, it's not.
Okay.
It is. So okay. Do you think there's a possibility that a drying trend will completely change migration routes? This is a question from Riley.
That's a good question. Personally, I would say that would have to be fairly localized, and it would probably depend on kind of the migratory connectivity, and would also have to be a very severe and consistent pattern in drought trends. So right now, the thing with drought, I should say overall, is the predictions of it really vary across space and season. So in this area, it's summer and fall predicted to become more dry. But some areas are kind of consistently predicted to become more dry. And I think those are areas like the Mediterranean and a few other spots. But some cases, places can become more wet and it can be very localized. And when we're looking at birds that are across, migrating across such a large distance, there would have to be, in my view, these really key stopover sites and really severe drought conditions consistently over time that the shorebirds couldn't rebound from that. But like we heard in Juliet's talk, if there are groups of individuals that are, consistently using the same timing and those drought conditions are the same or severe for those particular groups, that those could be affected. So that's kind of a very long about answer to say, I don't know, ultimately, because there's a lot of factors coming into play.
I'm going to ask you one other question really quickly, which is similar, which is what other options do the shorebirds have if they don't spend much time at James Bay?
Yeah, I think there's two options. Well, there's a couple options. They may stop earlier, so they might stop, up near Nelson River or things like this before James Bay, but that doesn't help the birds that skip those and come to James Bay southbound. They could make additional stops south of the boreal forest, for example, along the St. Lawrence or things like that would be maybe one of the first stops for them, because there's not much option when they're departing James Bay to go to the boreal forest. And that is a bit of a concern in some of our other work. We did find that birds departing in lower body condition were less likely to be picked up by Motus in the south. So it does seem like there might be a barrier effect where they have to get enough food at James Bay to be able to complete getting to the next site. So again, I think it depends on how good their body condition is or not, but I don't think there's a ton of options until they get south of the boreal. They can always stop, but I don't know how good it's going to be.
Interrupt you there, Allie. There are a few questions in the chat that maybe you can answer, but we'll move along now to the next speaker in the symposium. And again, thank you so much for that. The next speaker then is Marley Aikens, and she's going to be talking, and she is one of my graduate students, is currently living in Nova Scotia though. She's tracking fall migration routes and stopover behavior of semi-palmated plovers using the Motus Wildlife Tracking System. So go ahead, Marley.
Okay, just give me 1 second here. Okay. All right, perfect. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning into my talk. Thanks for the introduction, Erica. I'm a master's student at Trent University, and I'm going to be talking about my work on semi-palmated plover migration. The co-authors of this work are Dr. Erica Knoll and Dr. Glenn Brown. So I'll begin by quickly chatting about Arctic breeding shorebirds in general, which are migratory species that breed in the Arctic and subarctic, and then undertake these really extraordinary journeys, thousands of kilometers to non-breeding sites, anywhere from the southern United States to the southern tip of South America. And one well-known Arctic breeding shorebird that Ali touched on is the roof-of redknot, and this is a species with migrations that can exceed 14,000 kilometers from the central Arctic to the southern tip of Tierra del Fuego. Another example is the Hudsonian godwit, a species that can travel nonstop from stopover sites in James Bay to wintering sites in South America in a matter of days. And so, as you might imagine, this can be it can be challenging to monitor the migrations of these birds as they're traveling at these enormous hemispheric scales. This is particularly true for birds with a smaller body mass that's too small to support things like GPS transmitters. So as a result, we still lack a basic understanding of migratory patterns for many small-bodied species, especially at an individual level, as Juliet mentioned in her talk. Luckily, in 2013, the Motus Wildlife Tracking System was developed. So the team behind Motus took a relatively old technology in terms of telemetry, radio tracking, and built an automated system that has the potential to track individuals at these big hemispheric scales. So today, Motus is a large network of automated receiving stations across North and South America, and to a lesser extent Europe, and it's expanding across the globe. So how it works is birds are fixed with a small coded transmitter, and then they're detected as they pass within the range of any of the more than 400 receiving stations in the network. So the Motus array has expanded each year, and there's particularly good coverage in the Atlantic Americas flyway, as we can see on the map to the right. So all of the yellow dots there are locations of a tower. Motus provides a really excellent opportunity to explore some unanswered questions in the field of movement ecology, because it can be used on these smaller bodied birds, and it provides relatively fine scale location data of about 10 to 50 kilometers without needing to retrieve the tagged bird, which is definitely a bonus. So one ideal study species for Motus is the Semipalmated plover, which is a small Arctic breeding shorebird pictured on the left. We would consider the Semipalmated plover an intermediate distance migrant, meaning it doesn't travel as far as our red knots or our godwits, but it still travels significant distances from breeding grounds in the Arctic, subarctic, and Canadian provinces, Atlantic Canadian provinces, shown in pink, to non-breeding grounds in southern USA, Caribbean, and South America, shown in blue. And this is a pretty widespread and common species, but we still don't know a lot about its migration habits at an individual level, or how habitats throughout the annual cycle are connected in space and time. So to try to understand more about Semipalmated plover migration habits, we used Motus to track their southbound migration from a subarctic breeding site. So we had two main objectives. The first, we wanted to broadly describe fall migration patterns in terms of migration timing, routes, and stopover ecology. So the location and durations of stopovers primarily. And then second, we aim to understand the mechanisms underlying these patterns we've described. So Juliet talked a lot about this, but our question here was, if we do see variation in migration behavior among individuals of a single population, what factors are driving these differences? And questions such as these are important because the timing and routes and stopover locations used during migration can determine what an individual bird experiences in terms of weather conditions, predation pressures, things like diet, stopover and wintering habitat quality. And although these experiences are happening at the level of the individual, they can have population level effects, which I think is the main theme that we're touching on in this symposium. So the population of Semipalmated plovers that we studied were birds breeding near Churchill in northern Manitoba, which is indicated by the arrow there. So Churchill's characterized by a subarctic climate and has a really unique ecosystem where the boreal forest, Arctic tundra, and Hudson Bay all intersect. And it's located within the Hudson Bay lowlands, which is outlined in yellow there. It's this really broad wetland complex, as Ali mentioned. And despite this being a really important area for millions of birds annually, it remains really understudied due to its inaccessibility. All right, so while in Churchill, we captured adults on the nest and affixed each with a radio transmitter, like shown on the left there. And then when possible, we monitored nests to determine nest fate. We also deployed 5 Motus receiving stations in the Churchill region to determine departure dates of birds as they departed the breeding site. And then those tagged birds were then detected by the rest of the Motus network as they traveled south. So this is a little bit of a spoiler, but a preliminary look at the data indicated that birds from Churchill do show some individual variation in migration behavior. So we investigated 2 factors that we hypothesized may be driving these individual differences: nest fate and sex. And so we were looking at these 2 factors because they influence the time and energy that an individual invests into breeding, which could then have downstream effects on migration behavior. And so we tested these effects using linear models and linear mixed effects models. Okay, so I'll talk about what we found starting with departure dates. This figure is showing sex on the x-axis, departure date on the y-axis, and the data are colored by nest fate with pre-hatch failure in yellow, post-hatch failure in blue, and fledging success in orange. And so birds with pre-hatch failure were birds that lost their nest prior to hatching, whereas birds with post-hatch failure hatched chicks, but they didn't survive until fledging. So what we found was females departed about 8 days before males did. And this is basically exactly what we expected because females abandon the chicks and the male about a week before males do. We also found that parents with pre-hatch failure departed about 9 days before parents with fledging success. So this is a little bit lower than we expected because the chick rearing period is 21 days. So that would be the lowest value that we would expect to see in between these two groups. So this is suggesting that the birds that are having pre-hatch failure are staying on the breeding sites after their nest fails rather than migrating right away. And so overall, what this is showing is that both sex and nest fate do affect departure timing and thus the onset of migration in this species. Okay, so based on the results of the previous slide, birds with pre-hatch failure departed later than we expected them to, suggesting these birds are sticking around on the breeding grounds after nest failure. So to better understand this result, we looked at the relationship between departure date and breeding completion date, which is the breeding completion date would be the earliest date we would expect a bird to migrate. So we asked the question, how soon after completing parental duties do birds begin fall migration? So we found that for birds with fledging success and post-hatch failure, shown in blue and orange, there was a really strong relationship between breeding completion and departure dates. So birds were generally departing promptly after breeding completion. But for birds with pre-hatch failure, so no hatching success at all, shown in yellow there, we see that there's a weak relationship. So this is showing that birds are indeed sticking around on the breeding grounds after failure, possibly to prospect future nesting opportunities, to scope out territories for breeding in future years. There may also be some sort of threshold date that birds are waiting around until and then departing after that date. All right. So next, we looked at migration routes. So here are partial migration routes of 92 birds we tracked from the Churchill area elsewhere in North America. And each panel, the panels are separated by nest fate, just to try to delineate some patterns. The data are colored by sex with females in purple and males in green. And I say that they're partial because we don't necessarily know for sure where these birds ended up. They could be wintering somewhere without significant Motus coverage, such as somewhere in South America, or the tags could have fallen off in these regions where we last detected them. So all birds tracked beyond the breeding grounds traveled southeast towards the Atlantic coast. The majority traveled through the Great Lakes region and onto the US coast. Some birds opted to travel through James Bay to go say hello to Ali, our previous speaker, and continued on to the Bay of Fundy region of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Maine. And then finally, some birds took an apparently interior route straight through to the US Atlantic coast. We didn't see any significant differences among birds of different sex or nest fates. Though most of our birds seemingly disappeared in North America, we were able to track 9 individuals to South and Central America. So 8 of these birds traveled 7 of these birds traveled through the Great Lakes region to the US Atlantic coast, and then were later detected in French Guiana, Suriname, or the Barbados. One individual departed Churchill and wasn't subsequently detected until it showed up in Panama a month later. So that's kind of an interesting result. This individual presumably took an interior route through the United States. So this is showing that birds from this population are wintering as far south as South America and potentially even further south where there are fewer towers. Okay, and finally, we looked at stopover behavior. So this figure is showing the locations of reported stopovers, colored by sex, and the length of stay indicated by the size of the point. So we found 3 major stopover regions, all located on the Atlantic coast. The first is the Bay of Fundy region. So this is an area with extensive mudflats that are known to be highly productive for migrant shorebirds, particularly in the fall. The second is Cape Cod, Long Island Sound region. So this is a really populous area that's also a known shorebird hotspot during migration. And finally, the last region was the coast of the Delmarva Peninsula. As Ali mentioned, it's a really important stopover location and staging location in both spring and fall, and a really well-known spot as well. Most birds that were detected here were detected in Delaware Bay, which is located on the northern edge of Delmarva. So birds from the one population in Churchill are stopped over in geographically separated but clustered areas on migration. And the stopover duration ranged from a few hours to 25 or more days. So these locations are important for quick stops as well as longer periods of stopover. And we didn't see any patterns in terms of sex or nest fate, though we did find that males did tend to stop over for a bit longer than females did. These stopover locations are well-known hotspots, like I said, so it really underscores the importance of these areas for the conservation of this species, but also other shorebirds with similar life history characteristics. Okay, so in summary, we found that sex and nest fate influenced departure timing of semi-palmated plovers, with males migrating after females and successful breeders departing after failed breeders. We found that there is individual variation in migration route, but it doesn't seem to be explained by sex or nest fate. Birds adopted several different routes after breeding. We also found variation in stopover location, but with 3 major hotspots. And birds are using these locations for short periods or very briefly, and for longer periods as well. Finally, we found that some birds from this population are wintering at least as far south as northern South America, which is 7,000 kilometers from Churchill. So pretty far distances that these birds are traveling. And expanding the Motus network will be really key to understanding the wintering ranges of this species and other Arctic breeding shorebird populations. So just a take-home message. So with ranges that are often spanning the globe, shorebirds and many bird species are a huge conservation challenge, as we all know. But the more that we understand about how breeding, migration, and non-breeding habitats are connected in space and time, and why, the better we will be equipped to diagnose, address, and hopefully prevent further population declines. So better understanding of annual movements leads to more informed conservation action. Perfect. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Marley. That was really great summary of your research. Okay, so we have a couple of questions in the chat. We have a couple of minutes here. Did any birds re-nest after, okay, I've lost it here, after nest failure? And if so, were their stopover durations shorter?
Yes, we did have some birds that nested, that did re-nest. I haven't looked into whether their stopover durations were shorter or not. But generally those birds left later, and we didn't see any effect on birds that left later on stopover duration, which I kind of expected that we would find some sort of difference between birds that left the breeding grounds later in terms of their stopover duration, but we didn't find anything.
Did any of your semi-palmated plovers switch from one hot spot to another within a single migration? One of those different migration stopover sites?
That's a great question. So for all of the birds that we had, that we did record a stopover for, there was only one stopover recorded for each individual. So no, it doesn't seem that they are hopping from one spot to another. In saying that, it's absolutely possible that the birds are stopping over elsewhere outside of the range of the towers. So it's not to say that it's not happening, but according to the data that we have, no, they're just sticking to one location.
Okay, and Jeff Costa has a question. Did you have any issues with false positives on the Motus network? If so, what was your strategy with these?
Yes, definitely. Lots of filtering and lots of data checking. So looking at you can look at how the bird passes by the antenna and plot it, and that's a really helpful tool to use. And so birds that are, as they fly by a tower, you generally see this U-shaped pattern of the signal strength, or how strong the tag is being recorded by the tower. And so if you plot that out, you can usually get a pretty good idea of whether or not it's an actual bird. If it's noise, it's usually just a mess. So that was one of my go-to. And there's a lot of other filtering that you can do within the Motus R package that helps a lot too.
And Francie had a quick question about how did you attach the transmitters?
Yes, so we clipped a few feathers above the preen gland and then applied a little bit. It's essentially super glue to a base of the feathers and to the skin. And then when the bird molts, the tag will fall off on its own.
And there was one other question too. Does one partner desert during breeding, natural desertion, like in semi-palmated plovers? And pipers, rather. So.
The females generally leave the family unit about 8 days before males do, so about 2/3 of the way into the chick rearing period.
And have you partnered or contacted groups at any of the 3 hotspots to potentially learn more about these birds at stopover locations?
No, but that would be a great thing to do, because I know that these are hotspots and that there are programs ongoing in these areas. So definitely a great option. There's a lot of Motus work happening, particularly in the Delaware Bay area. So that's great.
Okay, well, thank you very much. There are a couple of other questions. Maybe you could look in the chat and respond to those people, but we'll move on now. And thanks again for a great talk, Marley.
Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is is Patrick Donnelly. Sorry, Patrick. I'm just
no problem. Thanks, Erica.
I just wanted to make sure I got the title right. Patrick Donnelly, he's from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he's going to be speaking to us about migration efficiency sustains connectivity across agroecological networks supporting sandhill crane migration. So go ahead, Pat.
Thank you, Erica. And just one thing, I did send you a quick email with 2 links in it. If you can drop those in the chat while I'm talking, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, will do.
Okay. Let me share a screen here. And so again, thanks everyone for taking the time to, during the meeting today, as Erica said, we're going to be talking about migration efficiency in sandhill cranes. This is part of a paper that's already been published, so I'm going to skim over a lot of the kind of the detailed information in the paper, but if you want to reach out and get more information about today's talk, please feel free to connect to this work online and read more about it. The populations we'll be talking about today, although there's a number of subspecies in North America, we'll be looking at greater sandhill cranes in the Western US. 3 subpopulations here you can see in yellow, red, and blue: the Rocky Mountain, the Central Valley, and the lower Colorado River population segments. And what's unique about these birds in the Intermountain West is their reliance on systems that are tied to agriculture. And this is a view from the Rocky Mountain Crane Survey that's flown in the fall. And this is the area in the Bear River watershed in southeast Idaho. And you can see here, there's a lot of water in the landscape. This is a large riparian floodplain that is irrigated for hay production. And while these natural wetlands are no longer natural, they've been modified to some degree, they still provide an incredible ecological value for waterbirds and ecosystem services that are important across the West. So having an understanding of how birds utilize these systems as a network across the West is important to us, as increasing water scarcity threatens to change policies that control Western water laws and change the habitat availability and land use practices associated with these birds. This is another example of of how some of these systems work. When we say agriculture in the West, people often think about row crops and tomatoes and potatoes, but these systems that are growing hay are largely natural, but only modified. And this is an example of the Star Valley in eastern Wyoming, or western Wyoming, sorry. And here they're grazing cattle directly on this riparian system, moving flood irrigated water out of that system to charge up that groundwater hydrology. These also include wildlife refuges as well that are inclusive to this network. And this is the Grays Lake National Wildlife Refuge in southeast Idaho. This is during a drought year condition, which is more emblematic of how these systems have been functioning in the past decade, as we're seeing increased temperatures, reduced wetland functionality across these systems. These drier conditions, even in our natural systems that are protected, are more persistent. Another example here of the upper Beaverhead watershed in the upper Missouri. Again, a large riparian system in southwest Montana that's critically important to birds. When we think about what these distributions of wetlands have done across the West, is they've often been tied to agriculture, not only in how they use water in the floodplain, but you can see here to the right in the upper hand corner is a distribution of small grain, which is irrigated agriculture outside the floodplain. It's an important food resource for sandhill cranes during migration as well. So we see not only water use in the floodplain that supports wetlands directly through flood irrigation, but this balance of irrigated water use across the West that's critically important. And again, as water scarcity increases, how do we maintain this equity among water use that supports agriculture, those that support small grains provide food resources, but also that agricultural footprint that provides those important resources for birds that are using those wetlands that are linked to agriculture as well. And earlier work we've done shows that over almost 2/3 of wetlands in the West are tied to these important wetland resources. So we can't ignore agriculture in this larger kind of perspective and how these resources work across the West. And so to actually look at this information in more detail, we marked 108 greater sandhill cranes across the West with GPS transmitters. The map on the left-hand side of your screen shows the distribution of those points. The number next to those individual points tell you how many deployments were occurred on that site. Most of the birds in the population were tagged in the Middle Rio Grande Valley on the wintering grounds in central New Mexico, but there were a number of birds in Idaho, Oregon, Montana that were also tagged on the breeding grounds as well. Throughout the process of monitoring the movement ecology of these species, there's 187, almost close to 200 northward migrations were completed and 150 southward migrations across that network. We took all this information and applied it. It looks like this. This is the raw data in panel B you see here of the raw tracks from 3 population segments, blue showing Rocky Mountain, red showing lower Colorado River Valley, and green showing the Central Valley populations. We then took that information, used first passage time analysis, as well as dynamic habitat segmentation to classify those points based upon their annual cycle. What you see here in red are breeding locations. Green delineate stopover areas, and blue show the wintering areas in the south. I will say that some of the wintering areas also function as stopover sites, as well as some of the breeding locations across the West. Taking that information, we're then able to establish a theoretical network connecting these points. You see some very long connections between some migration stops. These are probable movements, but very low probability. We weighted those connections based upon the movements birds demonstrated throughout the network. So although you see some direct movements that are potentially viable from, say, southern Arizona all the way up to Utah, the probability of those birds making those movements is very low, and those played into how the network modeling was actually determined in the long run. To analyze these different systems, what we ended up doing was using network theory and circuit theory, and we tested to determine what parts of this type of relationship and how birds move through the network were most important to determining their utility and utilization of Western North America wetland stopover sites. Between this essentially tells us how important that individual stopover site was connecting the shortest distances between wintering grounds and breeding grounds. Degree of centrality was a little bit different. It told us how many connections that individual stopover site had to go to different places. And we move over to circuit theory, we looked at things a little bit differently. We looked at effective resistance. So basically, is we look at things across the network and determining how much effective resistance was occurring or how much redundancy do we see in those pathways that occurred in the system. So basically, as you see the figure shown here from A all the way down to B at the bottom, what you see here is more redundancy is better reducing that resistance, allowing birds options as they move through that system. So as we decrease the amount of stopover sites and that redundancy, birds have fewer options. So we use that effective resistance in circuit theory also to measure how the system would change if we begin to remove stopover sites randomly using a modeling approach. What we were able to do was walk through the process, measure each of these types of network connections throughout the entire stopover site that we constructed across the Western North America to determine that cranes in between this was actually that most important factor. We assumed that birds are moving through that site, trying to preserve energetic costs, moving up and down, that between this rate and choosing the sites that were shortest between wintering and summering areas were most important to birds as they cross throughout the network and the system. Now, when we rank between this as that most important factor, using that same connectivity map I showed you previously for spring and fall, what you're seeing here are those same nodes we showed you before, but there's different sizes in those nodes. The larger the node is, the more important that betweenness factor is. And by removing that node, we dramatically change the energetic expenditure, the cost of migration, by increasing the distance as birds have to travel to reach breeding and wintering grounds. And so what we see across a line about where you see southern Nevada and southern Colorado occur is an important ecotone where we move from semi-arid systems to arid systems. And what happens at that point is you increase that effective resistance, and birds have fewer options, so they act as funnels. And so birds must connect with those nodes prior to moving to more arid systems in the south. And by removing those nodes, you can dramatically increase the cost of migration. So these become higher priorities for us at a flyaway scale to begin investing in those conservation, those landscapes to ensure that they remain productive and resilient into the future. So this gave us a perspective of how this system is working at a continental scale to get us to where we need to deliver conservation. Now, the second part of this was to go in and actually look at what's happening on the ground. And on the ground and looking inside of these individual network nodes, we use a series of covariates to determine how birds are moving locally within these landscapes. And we looked at things like the area of small grains, distance to water, area to alfalfa, bare soil, et cetera. We had about a list of initially about 50 different covariates. We pared it down to about 10. And using random forests, we determined that grain area and distance to water were those most important and critical values that were structuring bird distributions inside of those landscapes. What I'm going to do now is pop out here and show you guys, if I can get around this stuff here, but how we actually did that. And in Idaho, what we're doing, here's an example of a beta model for some of our wetland distributions, determining where wetlands were across landscapes. We actually modeled over about 40 years the distributions of surface water. If I turn this guy on here, it actually should be drawing up. And it is not working for some reason. So I'm going to pop back over into the presentation so I can do that for you guys, because this is not working for me here. I apologize for that. Whenever you try to demonstrate something live on the web, there's always a possibility of things crashing. Back to the share. Erica, if you could drop those two links into the chat, it'll give you guys a link to some of those wetland models that I tried to demonstrate. You guys can look at them on your own as I'm talking or after the talk as well. So let me get back to, sorry, still having some technical difficulties. There we go. So determining grain and distance to water are most important. We began to measure those trends long-term inside the stopover areas to determine that these surface water abundance during spring and fall migration are declining significantly. And this is comparable to work we've done in the past, looking at effects of functional wetland loss. We're showing that seasonal, temporary, and semi-permanent wetlands all declining from the mid-1980s to now, showing us that this is a possible stressor occurring across these stopover sites, both in fall and in spring. We also looked at the distribution and abundance of small grain as a factor that could be affecting food resources for sandhill cranes. And you can see two lines here. The blue line here represents the overall abundance of small grain crops, things like oats, barley, and wheat. We saw really no difference across those time periods. And we also measured and developed a tillage model. That's what happens post-harvest. Producers will go in and actually till the soil, reducing the abundance of waste grain that occurs in those fields, reducing the ability for those birds to access those grains. And we saw, although it reduces that abundance by some, that abundance or that process of tillage is pretty constant across the landscape. So we didn't feel that grain really was limiting birds in very many ways across the entire network. We also looked at space use inside of those individual networks. And what we found was that private lands made up about 80% of that overall use. Now there's some nuances here inside individual population segments. And we found seasonally in the wintertime, birds are more reliant on public lands like wildlife refuges, but for the most part, it was a private lands game. We also found that during spring, birds utilize wetlands at a much higher rate. We theorize this is because birds are shifting their diet to larger protein base in preparation for breeding as they move towards the summering grounds. But there was a specific wetland type that was actually selected during that process. It was seasonal wetlands, those wetlands that are flooded more than 2 months, but less than 9 months out of the year, where cranes occupy the majority of their time during spring migration. During fall, we found those uses were equitable. This is a time of the year where there is limited water in the landscape, and any water that's available in wetlands, cranes utilize equally during that process. So in conclusion, what we found during this research was for conservation, we have to focus on a small number of key sites which structure those populations and are important to maintaining connectivity between wintering and breeding grounds. We also found that wetland sustainability was the greatest limiting factor, perhaps, across this network. We saw long-term declines in these systems, likely from climate change and changing functional use where these wetlands are drying over faster periods of time, reducing their availability to birds. And wetland location mattered as well. I didn't touch on this very well in the previous slide, but distance to water was an important and critical factor to those foraging resources. So not just conserving any wetland, but those wetlands that maintain that ability for cranes to minimize their movements within that migration network when they're in those stopover sites. And the big difference between those habitat needs and wetland use also told us that there's differences in how we think about conservation, both for spring and fall migration. And so we might have to have very different conservation strategies to preserve spring versus fall because we see differences in wetland use in time and space. Folks that are interested in this research or in the links that I sent out that you guys can look at from some of the wetland modeling that we've been doing, which will become a dashboard for all of our wetland results and waterbird results in Western North America, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm at the University of Montana. I'm happy to answer any questions now. And again, thanks everyone for the time and sharing this science with you all. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks very much, Patrick. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. And the first one is somebody, Allie Anderson, is curious about the land cover layers you use to estimate wetland water cover. And I'm not sure if they're in those links or not, but maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, so if you guys open up the links, what we ended up doing was constructing a model for Western North America that allows us to look at wetland surface water conditions monthly over the last 30 years, or almost 40 years now. And we can reconstruct seasonal, temporary, and semi-permanent wetland systems from that. And we actually cookie cuttered those out using the stopover sites to determine how birds link to those sites and what the conservation or ecological effects were and ecosystem water balance occurring in individual sites. So if you open up those links, you can scroll through those wetland apps. We'll be releasing a West-wide version of those apps in the first quarter of 2020. So everyone on the call here will be able to access that information directly and utilize it in any other waterbird conservation efforts. We're utilizing it not only with cranes, but some of our white-faced ibis work and waterfowl work as well. So that's a model that we built on our own using Google Earth Engine and satellite data to reconstruct wetland hydrology.
Okay, good. And there is another question. Any cranes stopping over at saline lakes?
The use of saline lakes for most birds were directly minimal. We saw some of the freshwater systems on the periphery of those lakes utilize fairly significantly, but the ones actually utilizing saline lakes directly were not. I know mid-continent birds in the Texas Panhandle use saline lakes exclusively for roosting, but in this population, we saw only minimal use of saline lakes for most birds.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Patrick. And we're going to move on to our next speaker for the session, and we will have some time at the end too for further questions. So last speaker in this symposium is Laura McDuffie from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska. And the title of her talk is A Year in the Life of a Lesser Yellowlegs, and I'll let her explain. It's up on the screen. Thanks, Laura.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm going to be discussing some results from my master's work that I actually just completed this past spring. So there were actually many different collaborators that were involved in this project. So those are all listed here at the bottom. So the lesser yellowleg scientific name is Tringa flavipes. So that basically translates directly to a wading bird with yellow feet. So they are in the Scolopacidae family, which includes the sandpipers, the snipe, the turnstones, as well as the curlews. And the lesser yellowlegs isn't your typical beach dwelling bird that you would see zipping up and down the white sand beaches. They typically stay pretty inland. And so during the breeding season, the species uses a variety of different habitats, such as open woodlands, meadows, black spruce bogs, and urbanized regions as well. And then during the non-breeding period, they can be found in freshwater ponds, as well as in open rangelands and forests, brackish wetlands, saltwater tide pools, and even flooded agricultural areas, as well as aquaculture facilities. And so they forage mostly on aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates, such as the flies, snails, beetles, and dragonflies, but occasionally will eat fish and grains as well. And so this here is actually showing lesser yellowlegs foraging at Eielson Air Force Base, which is near Fairbanks, Alaska. So now that you understand a little bit about their basic life history characteristics, you may be asking yourself, why should I care about lesser yellowlegs? Well, it's because this pretty seemingly numerous species has and continues to experience a very precipitous decline. And so nearly all shorebirds that breed in North America are experiencing some sort of population decline. But the lesser yellowlegs in particular have experienced a very steep decline of between 63 to 70% just since the 1970s. And this information is based on the North American shorebird surveys, as well as road-based North American breeding bird surveys. And then if you look at just Alaska, within the Northwestern Interior Bird Conservation Region, which encompasses the vast majority of their breeding range within Alaska, we're actually seeing an annual decline of 5.3 to 9.2%. And again, that's based on those BBS, the breeding bird surveys, as well as Alaska land bird monitoring surveys. So decades ago, the population estimate was likely well over 1 million birds. But with this decline, today we see an estimate of about 660,000 individuals. But with this precipitous decline, it really suggests that the estimate should likely be revised downward to a more probable estimate of about 400,000 individuals. So there's a database called the Avian Conservation Assessment Database, or ACAD, and it was established by Partners in Flight and provides a conservation assessment and ranking for all of North American bird species. And so a species is ranked following the species prioritization matrix, which includes these 3 different metrics. So there's vulnerability, which basically is the species on a watch list. Decline has the species population declined by greater than 50%. And then there's this urgency metric, which you can also think of as half-life. So it's basically how long into the future it'll take a population to lose an additional 50% of its population. And so actually for the lesser yellowlegs, this metric is pretty startling, and it predicts that the species will be reduced in size by an additional 58% just within the next 11 years. And so the lesser yellowlegs is considered a priority species for conservation because of its high concern based on these different metrics. So we know that the species is in decline, but we also really need to know how and where geographically bottlenecks are occurring. So if you aren't familiar with this term, a population bottleneck is basically a sharp reduction in the size of a population due to environmental events such as fires and disease and droughts as well, and even human activities. And so if we look at different regions, so in Alaska, climate change may be a potential threat for the species. So there's a lot of permafrost thawing going on in some areas, which is causing wetlands to dry. In the prairie pothole region of North America, there's the leaching of pesticides and chemicals into ponds where the lesser yellowlegs forage. And this is a very productive agricultural region. And then even along the eastern seaboard, so the Atlantic coastline of the United States and Canada, there's increased infrastructure, which is reducing habitat for the species. In the Caribbean, the Guianas and Brazil, there's some unregulated harvest that's taking place, so that's a potential threat. And then lastly, in Argentina, there's quite a bit of rangeland intensification that's going on. So the conversion of lands to agriculture or rangelands for cattle grazing. So how would biologists actually determine where these bottlenecks may be occurring for this particular species? Well, they track the birds with miniaturized GPS transmitters. So we use these 4-gram low-tech Argos pinpoint 75 tags, and we attach them to birds using a leg loop harness method. So the tag would sit right on their back, as you can see in this photo here. And so one of the pros of these tags is that they are programmable. So basically you can space out the number of locations you want to receive over hours, days, weeks, even months if you want to. And also these tags do not require the biologist to recapture the bird. So locations are actually accessible remotely through Argos Web. So you can just go in and download the data that you need. One of the drawbacks of these tags is that they have an internal battery. They're not solar powered. So once you charge the tag before you deploy it, and that's all the battery you have for that tag. So in the study, we tracked birds from 7 different geographically unique populations. So Anchorage, Eielson Air Force Base, and Canadian National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, Yellowknife Northwest Territories, Churchill, Manitoba, James Bay, Ontario, and Mingan, Quebec. And so the value next to each of those locations is the total number of birds that were tracked between 2018 and 2021, which was the duration of this, this project. So in total, we tracked 115 birds. 59 of those were female, 50 were males, and 6 were an unknown sex. We were unable to determine. So birds actually carry these tags very well, to my relief. So only 4 tags out of those 115 did not collect any data at all. 74 or 64% of those tags collected full fall migratory routes from the departure from the breeding ground all the way to arrival at the non-breeding location. And then 27 or 24% of those tags collected data on the full annual cycle. So from breeding departure back to breeding site arrival. Here's a short video showing some birds carrying these tags. All right, so here's an animation of the actual track lines from all of these different birds. So you can see that they use a variety of different migratory routes and are dispersed across a pretty large area of the Western Hemisphere during the non-breeding period. So that animation is very informative and it's pretty fun to watch, but it actually takes looking at a still image to try to see different patterns that are occurring. So the first step in reaching the objective, which was to try to identify where those bottlenecks are occurring or where the threats are occurring, is to look at clusters of locations. So first I saw that there were many individuals that went or stopped through the prairie pothole region. So again, remember that there's a lot of agrochemical application that goes on here. So that is a potential threat when those birds ingest those chemicals potentially. And so there's actually a new graduate student that's just starting some work down there looking at contaminants in the blood. And then we saw quite a few birds stop in the Caribbean, the Guianas, and Brazil. And this is where unregulated harvest occurs. And this is actually the main focus of my graduate research, but not necessarily the focus of this talk today. And then in central Argentina, we saw quite a few individuals stop there. And so again, this is where a lot of rangeland intensification goes on. And so we actually have some new collaborators that are working down there conducting surveys actually during the boreal winter. So starting around this time of year, actually. So although the main focus of my research was to try to calculate the probabilities of occurrence of lesser yellowlegs within countries that participate in shorebird harvest, I was really curious about some of the basic migratory behaviors that may actually dictate how populations may encounter these different threats. So I kind of went in a different direction and decided to develop a secondary focus for my master's research. And so I examined migratory distance from breeding to non-breeding locations, different routes by sex and population, and migratory strategy. So first I looked at autumn migratory distance by sex and population, and the results were pretty inconclusive. So in Anchorage, Churchill, and Mingan, females tended to travel further than males, whereas at Canute, males traveled further than females, and Yellowknife, they traveled an equal distance. But the sample sizes were unequal among populations and among sex. So just make note of that. So then if we looked at migratory routes, this figure on the left, A shows autumn and B shows spring. And so in autumn, populations from Alaska, Yellowknife, and Churchill tended to use the Central Americas flyway, whereas the James Bay and Mingan population, which are the purple and yellow, they tended to follow pretty direct routes along the Atlantic Americas flyway. And so if we actually zoom in on James Bay and Mingan during autumn, we see another interesting pattern going on. So in 2018, I saw that birds actually completed stopovers along the Atlantic coastline, as well as Bermuda and other regions. But in 2019 and 2020, actually we didn't add Mingan until 2020, but several birds from James Bay, they actually completed transoceanic flights, so without stopping at all. And so now if we go back to panel B, which is spring, populations from Alaska, Yellowknife, and Churchill actually follow pretty tight corridor within the Central Americas flyway, as you can see here, whereas James Bay tended to stick to that Atlantic Americas flyway. Actually didn't have any data for Mingan for spring migration at this time. So then lastly, some observational results on movement strategies during the non-breeding period. So I was trying to examine what's going on during the non-breeding period. So I actually saw that there are two different strategies going on potentially. So there is nomadic birds. So these birds basically continued to move throughout the breeding period. They didn't stay in one particular spot. And then there was sedentary birds that used a single location throughout the non-breeding period. So they stayed, excuse me, they stayed in a single location for months on end. And so what I saw is that a larger proportion of Anchorage birds were sedentary compared to nomadic, and a larger proportion of Churchill birds were nomadic compared to sedentary. And also that males were more, tended to be more nomadic than females. Those tended to be more sedentary. But again, population size were unequal among populations and sex. All right, so understanding the migratory ecology and behavior of populations of lesser yellowlegs really is the first step in evaluating the susceptibility of the species to potential threats throughout the annual cycle. So the results I presented here, even though the sample sizes were small and populations, they were unequal, but it supports the idea that individuals from different populations likely experience known threats to different degrees throughout their annual migrations. So actually a good example of this, if you recall back to the migratory route slide, we saw that the Eastern Canada populations, that's James Bay and Mingan, they were more likely to follow that Atlantic Americas flyway and therefore travel through the Caribbean and Guyanas where shorebird harvest is most prevalent. So this really begged the question, so do those Eastern Canada populations have a greater likelihood of occurrence and therefore exposure in harvest regions? Well, without you having to read my entire thesis, I'll just tell you that that was in fact true. So it suggests that management actions should actually address populations with the greatest conservation needs rather than that typical whole species approach, which is followed sometimes. But this idea really does hold true for other threats beyond hunting. So agrochemicals, habitat alteration, climate change, all of those. And so additional studies really are needed in order to make the most scientifically informative management decisions for this declining species. All right, so these are my various funding sources. Definitely want to thank the Department of Defense. They provided the majority of the funding for all these tags that we used to track the birds. And many different collaborators were involved in this project. So I'd just like to say thank you. Feel free to send me emails or ask any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. That was really great. That was really interesting. Okay, so we'll take some questions for Laura. We have lots of time. I'm wondering, I'll ask a question. I'm wondering whether you have any initial observations from those areas in Argentina where they are, and what sort of things are you going to be measuring, or the people who are working down there are going to be measuring?
Yeah, so they just started down there, basically just trying to figure out where the birds are congregating in particular areas. They're also trying to recite some birds potentially, but they haven't seen any banded birds quite yet. But just trying to get an idea of the abundance of birds that are actually spending the winter, the boreal winter down there. So we're just in the beginning right now.
And I guess I have another question too, just in terms of the movements on the non-breeding grounds, which is really interesting that some are more sedentary than others. Where are they moving? Are they moving out of the country, like in Argentina, out of the country? Are they moving between, Brazil and Argentina, or maybe you can talk about that?
Yeah, so some birds were moving like hundreds of kilometers. They're moving into different countries. Some were moving kind of in circles, large circles, kind of moving around. It actually tended that the birds that were in Argentina, those are the ones that tended to be more sedentary, what I found. So that's definitely something to look into further.
Yes, that sounds like a really interesting avenue of research for sure, to just look at those different spots based on your research, which actually is you mentioned a small sample size, but in fact, that's a fantastic sample size.
Yes, that is, yeah.
This kind of work. Are there any other questions for Laura? Okay, well, I'll just make a couple of remarks about the sort of commonalities that I've picked up, and it's interesting that Laura mentioned all of these various threats that can occur along the the flyway for lesser yellowlegs, and I think she actually addressed probably everything that other people had mentioned, which is the importance of particular stopover sites, particularly in the Atlantic, the importance of these agro sites, which is something that Pat had mentioned, agricultural sites in the central and western part of North America, and then drought. You mentioned drought in Alaska and the effects of permafrost loss on wetlands, which also related to Allie's talk. And so it was kind of a talk that brought all of the other talks together. And so, I mean, at this point, I wouldn't mind if people have any questions for any of the speakers. We can address those. Are people ready to go? I do have one question for Pat, if you're still there. Patrick?
Yep, I'm here, Erica.
Yes, I'm just wondering about, you identified through your research those two key stopover sites for the cranes. What is the protection status of those two places?
So it varies depending on, of course, the seasonality, because we saw different uses from spring and fall migration. What we're doing right now inside those individual landscapes is working directly with the national wildlife refuges and state wildlife refuge areas, because what they're facing is increased impacts of changing water use that are more severe than what you might find on adjacent private lands. And so they're often operating off of the same irrigation network to maintain those managed wetlands. But because of the way we've set up Western water laws and priorities and budgets to move water around, they're more vulnerable than the private lands adjacent. So we're first helping those folks there. And we're working directly with folks like the Natural Resources Conservation Service to work with private landowners to prioritize flood irrigation. What's happening is people are seeing flood irrigation as a wasteful use of water, when in fact it has a tremendous amount of ecosystem benefit, not only for birds, but amphibians and fisheries. And so we're trying to change perspective in Western water policy that maintains flood irrigation in those important areas that have that value, and places on the uplands that you can convert from flood irrigation to sprinkler to grow alfalfa. We say, let's do conservation there for water efficiency, but let's not decouple this long-term beneficial use in flood irrigation that keeps producers active in producing, keeps urbanization out, but also preserves all these ecosystem services. So it's a messaging plus a conservation on private lands, plus a conservation on public lands, is a network that really makes these things go in the West.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions for now? I might just sum up some of the key messages then that I took from all of this. And one of the ones just from every talk, I think, is that birds tend to use efficient migration. Obviously, they're on an energy budget. They find the good spots for food. Allie has shown that. And even with the whimbrel talk, some of those birds are obviously finding stopover sites in Ireland and the UK that are important for their migration. And that these stopover sites are really important. And I think everybody, every single researcher talked about the importance of stopover sites. And I think most people now do view conservation of birds as being a life cycle approach, that we need to look at all of these different sites, but we need to work with local practitioners to be able to conserve those stopover sites. I was interested that in general, like breeding affects timing, but not necessarily locations or the routes of birds. And so that means that as Allie showed with white-rumped sandpipers, that they need to go long distances. And so they're much more robust with respect to maybe variation in local conditions. Although I think that's a future research topic. There are obviously, for almost all species, spring and fall differences. So those may not be individual, they may be population-based, but for some, there are also individual differences in spring and fall migration patterns. I mentioned, I think that drought effects are important, and they're going to become more and more important. The questions that were asked of Allie, again, just does it actually change the migration route? And Laura may see some of those differences too, and Pat, in terms of obviously drought effects on migratory behavior and direction, speed, all of those different things. And Juliet had mentioned the contrast between internal factors and external factors. And it looks like with all of these species, there's a combination of those things. Internal factors like what's happening on the breeding grounds are important, but external factors like weather and obviously the drought and locations of particular stopover fix are also important in terms of individual variation. And then finally, I'm just going to say that it's obviously very clear that collaboration is super important for this sort of research. And it's really great to see that science is moving to be much, much more collaborative. And so I do see one more question for Laura. What was the mass of the pinpoint tags relative to the mass of the lesser yellowlegs, Laura?
Yeah, so we actually only deployed these tags on birds that weighed a minimum of 80 grams. So our cutoff was 5% of the bird's body mass. So there were quite a few birds that we captured that were in the 70 gram range. And so those we did not track.
And do you think that would affect any of your results?
Potentially. I mean, just looking at capture mass versus how the birds tag, I guess, did over the course of the year. The larger birds didn't actually seem to do any better than the birds that weighed less. So that's definitely something to look into, but it doesn't seem to be a factor.
Okay. All right. Well, I think this was a great, oh, Juliet has raised her hand. Juliet, go ahead.
Sorry, I just had a thought, and I don't think this is going to be very well formulated, so apologies in advance. But thinking about not only sort of how these migratory birds can link together different scientific collaborators, but also how they can link together sort of scientific and social collaborations. I think Patrick's talk was really inspiring in that way of thinking about how to develop tools and integrate, you know, these kind of partnerships with private landowners. Something else that I think was at the World Seabird Conference, I saw a presentation about some groups that are working with Inuit hunters in the Arctic to actually put out transmitters on, I think, thick-billed murres, and like to share the data with them as they go along. So I'm curious if anyone in the symposium or anyone sort of sitting in has ideas about ways that we can kind of leverage all these data that we have from migratory birds to kind of, I guess, inspire people and like bring in kind of that social side to the conservation and maybe do a better job of kind of sharing those data with people outside the scientific community.
Allie, did you want to speak to your, yeah.
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about a lot. I'm now working a contract with Smithsonian where we are aggregating large numbers of shorebird tracking data. And the goal is to use those to benefit conservation. But as I've been thinking about this question, I realized that there are multiple types of conservation and multiple views on what conservation is and what people think would be most meaningful. So this is something that is really like I'm still trying to wrap my head around it as far as prioritizing steps, because there are so many different facets. And so, you know, some things we've thought about are like the education and outreach. We've heard from many different local people who are working at specific sites that, you know, they want to know for their site, where are birds coming from and how, like they want to know their site and the connectivity. And so I think there's opportunities there for, you know, having tools with the data that could allow people to see, okay, with all these tracking devices, where did birds come directly to them and where after, just to get a sense of their site in like the place of migration. But then there's also much more bigger term objectives that are, you know, like Juliet had with the seabirds, you know, for shorebirds, are they using traditional flyways? Do these hold up? These sort of questions that are important conservation questions, but in some cases it comes down, at least what I'm realizing now, how to prioritize them, you know, is a challenge, but maybe others have suggestions there. But I think there's a lot of opportunities, but yeah, again, where are the efforts best spent? And maybe it's a mixture of all of them.
Okay, Pat had a a question? Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. This is a follow-up to Juliet's question about how collaboration can be more inclusive. And what I'd encourage folks to do, if you're not already familiar with joint ventures, I'm a joint venture staff member, and that's a branch, you might call it, of the Migratory Bird Program of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And joint ventures were created out of originally the North American Waterfowl Management Plan to link up science and conservation needs at flyway scales so that we can be directing and collaborating in those landscapes where those limiting factors are really focused in. And joint ventures provide a model partnership. And our joint venture, in the Intermountain West joint venture, even though I'm a Fish and Wildlife Service employee, I work directly with private landowners. I work directly with state wildlife agencies and NGOs, and that's the framework that comes with the JV. And so for folks that are interested in developing and connecting your science to that framework that already exists, I would encourage you to reach out to your regional joint venture or multiple joint ventures, because oftentimes we're talking about these continental migrants. Even though I work for one JV, I collaborate with joint ventures that touch Mexico and go into Canada and to Alaska, just so that we can combine these information, so we can connect it to our partnerships and really get down to a flyway scale need to a local scale action. And so just an encouragement there for folks to look to your joint ventures as well as your flyway committees as well. So look at that non-game tech committee in the Central Pacific Atlantic Flyways, Mississippi, and those are great groups of folks too. They're linked up to a lot of these larger continental scale needs, questions, and science, and will run with your information if you really engage those folks. Just a side note. So thanks, Juliet, for asking the question.
And Chris, you raised your hand.
Yes, I was just curious if a small nonprofit or a small group of people wanted to deploy a Motus array, what is the cost to buy the product and get it deployed?
I wonder, maybe, I don't know, Marley, maybe you want to go ahead. I just spent several months doing this, so I don't know, but.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Ali. You probably have a better idea of
okay.
The current cost.
Yeah, this spring I set up 12 stations west of Ottawa in Canada. Anyways, short answer is it depends, but generally looking from anywhere between $2,000 to $6,000 for an individual station. When you put a station up, you can receive information on that particular station, and then whatever other researchers have up open access through Motus's webpage. But anyways, the cost depends on kind of how robust you want your station, if it needs to be freestanding or if it needs to be attached to another structure. There's now some new integrated tools that allow for different tracking devices. We were using, I would say, in our projects, we were using freestanding stations. So those are pop-up stations that you have to guy line, but we were trying to make them very robust. And we were working at about $6,000 per station. So it depends, but that's kind of the starting range.
Good, that gives me a good ballpark. Thanks. Okay, well, we'll finish the session now so people have time to maybe breathe a bit before Juliet is running the career panel, another service that she's doing to the Waterbird Society. And I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart, the speakers for today's session. And I thought that was a really great session with lots and lots of wonderful ideas to go forward. So thanks again, everybody.